Dear ladies and gentlemen, my very warm welcome to all of you. This is the second day of the conference On the Road to Responsible Sourcing. This conference is run as part of the EU project Resourcing by the Institute for Managing Sustainability at the Vienna University of Economics and Business. So we are sitting here in Vienna on a nice and sunny day. My name is Ursula Kopp. I'm part of this team at the Institute for Managing Sustainability, and I will be your host and the facilitator of this conference. I'm specialized in facilitation of innovation processes and of multi-stakeholder dialogues. This is the second conference of this EU project Resourcing. The opening conference in January this year focused on the key drivers of responsible sources. And with this conference on the road to responsible sourcing, we want to ask the major question whether and how responsible sourcing of mineral raw materials can achieve impact for both the society and the environment. This question is being addressed from three different angles. Yesterday, we started with keynote addresses and two intense discussions on due diligence in the supply chain. Today, our topic is green transition. We will hear about the resourcing project's new roadmap 2050 for responsible sourcing in the renewable energy sector. And day 3, tomorrow afternoon, we'll look at the intersection of circular economy and responsible sourcing. We are really proud to be the host of this big conference. Nearly 400 people have signed in from all over the world and about 50% from industry, which makes us very happy. The recordings of all 3 days will be available to you on the conference website in the section Resources. You just have to register and then you can get access at any time. Also, at any time during the conference, you're more than welcome to take part via the Slido chat. You can always put some questions there or comments and even discuss with each other through direct comments if you want. And if you want to do so and take part in the conversations today, please don't forget to click on the live button so that you're with us at the same time. In case you need any technical support, there is my colleague Noe in the background. You can reach him via email if something goes wrong with your connection here. So what's ahead of us today? We would like to start with 2 keynotes before the break, and we will have a panel discussion after the break. And after that, at about 11:45, there will be 3 related projects that will be presented. And after that, there will be time for an informal exchange, but I will explain everything step by step afterwards. And these informal exchanges at the end will be facilitated by the project manager of the resourcing project, Alexander Graf, my colleague. So let's get started. Let's get into the topic. And because I'm not the expert here, we have we are honored to have an expert here again today to facilitate the next 1.5 hours. We get into the topic green transition, and I'm very happy to introduce Masuma Faroki, the consulting director of Mainhutte. She's a development economist who has worked in the sustainability and the extractive sector for more than 10 years. And her focus is on measuring the socioeconomic impact of the resource sector and developing frameworks for the implementation of responsible mining practices. Her cross-disciplinary research focus includes economic, political, and legal risk identification and assessment, expertise in ESG indicators and their measurement, value chain analysis, investment and trade policies, and so on and so on. So welcome with me, an expert who has worked in Europe, Africa, and China with all sorts of stakeholders. Masuma, the floor is yours to facilitate the first part of our conference day.
Thank you very much, Ursula, and a warm welcome to everyone in at least the Northern Hemisphere, where we're sort of descending into autumn and winter, and the Southern Hemisphere, I'm sure you're enjoying a lot of sunshine at the moment. Today, I have the honor of moderating the session on the green transition, which I think from a European perspective, given the current gas price crisis that we're having, and COP26, which has just concluded, The need for the transition is urgent. I think we all agree on this because it affects the most vulnerable within our own economies and within our own communities. So there is no condition of sort of saying green transition, not an option. We know we are committed to it. But the how is the challenge that faces us. And the Responsible Sourcing Project makes two major contributions to this. One is to learn from what is already going on, but also to emphasize that on this road to green transition, we cannot ignore how that transition happens from the extraction to the smelting to the refining to the recycling. So everything that's going into supporting the green transition needs to be sustainable as well. Now, as part of that, we have the honor of presenting our roadmap on renewable energy, which is led by Marie-Therese. Marie-Therese is a mining engineer from Montana University in Leoben, and she's been working on sustainable mining practices. And in the last 2 years, I have grown to appreciate her ability, which maybe comes from her engineering mind, to take so much information on environment, on social, on governance, on demands of saying this needs to happen, this needs to happen. And she put together, with support from the team, this wonderful responsible sourcing roadmap that answers questions. It is a 100-page document, but Marie-Therese is going to help us, lead us, walk through it. I would encourage everybody to go through our webpage and look at the document detail in detail. But she is going to talk about how we get that green transition from the renewable energy perspective in a sustainable manner, taking with us all sorts of stakeholders. Now, to give more guidance or to discuss the roadmap that we're laying out, Marie-Therese is going to be joined by a few discussants, and I'm going to introduce them now so they can step in without me having to interrupt that conversation in the panel. First of all, we are joined by Myra Nyberg, who is a policy officer at the Energy Intensive Industries and Raw Materials of the European Commission, DG for Internal Market, Industry and Entrepreneurship, and SMEs. Myra has the Herculean task of being responsible for policy on sustainability and secondary raw materials and framework conditions for primary raw materials. Now, that's a title in a line, but that encompasses so much that it would be really interesting to hear what Myra has to say of the myriad things that we heard. Our next discussant is going to be Raffaele Rossi. Raffaele is almost an old friend of the project. We've been taking up his time in the last 2 years, trying to get his input and the industry's input on renewable energy. He's a policy analyst with Solar Power Europe, where he leads on matters regarding sustainability. He coordinates the solar and storage work stream and is part of their market intelligence team involved in the data analysis that works around Solar Power Europe's flagship publications on global market outlook and EU market outlook. Our next discussant is going to be Isabella Guskin, who works at Just Energy Transition. She's a senior program officer at Friends of the Earth in Netherlands. And she works from a north-south perspective, which is extremely important because renewable energy is not going to be a European-only concern. It needs to balance out what's happening in the south, where most of the minerals are coming from, and look at their just energy transition as well. So Isabella is going to be talking about from a community perspective. She's been very active with local communities and civil society organizations, and we look forward to hearing what she has to say on these issues. Then we have Benjamin Katz, again, I would say an old friend of the project, since we take up a lot of his time and say, Ben, can you help us with this? And he's been absolutely delightful. He works on mineral supply chain due diligence at the OECD's Center for Responsible Business Conduct, in particular on critical minerals and base metals. And he coordinates the OECD's work on measuring the uptake and impact of due diligence standards. Apart from that, Ben knows everybody who needs to be known within the supply chains for these things, and we really appreciate his help over the last few years. Finally, we have Estelle Gervais. She's a research fellow at the Fraunhofer Institute for Solar Energy Systems in Freiburg. She specializes in raw material criticality, sustainability strategies, and circularity for current and future PV technologies. Again, because our roadmap looks at all stages of the renewable energy cycle, we're delighted that somebody from the circular side of this conversation will also be drilling us how good or badly we got our roadmap right. those are introductions done. I think let's get on with the main part of this session. And I invite Marie-Therese to tell us what has been taking up her life for the last 2 years.
Yes, good morning from a very foggy Leoben today. Thank you for the kind introduction, Masuma. I'm happy to take you through the renewable energy sector roadmap. So let's get started. We have a lot of material and information ahead of us. You already heard yesterday in Alexander's presentation at the beginning of the conference that the resourcing project considers 3 sectors and develops sectoral roadmaps for all of them. The aim is to contribute to a global definition and a global uptake of responsible sourcing of mineral raw materials in the renewable energy, the mobility, and the electronic sector. 3 sectors that are really crucial for the EU Green Deal. The first of the 3 sectors is the renewable energy sector, which has completed its work in summer this year. And I'm now going to introduce this sector and our results in more detail. Based on expert feedback at the very beginning of the project, we focused on the supply chains of wind turbines and solar PV modules. The supply chain stages we consider in more detail are the mining of copper, rare earth elements, and quartz, and the manufacturing and recycling of the turbines and modules themselves. We started our work last year in June with an overview of the current situation in these supply chains, or in the nodes of the supply chains I just mentioned. This overview is the so-called State of Play report, which was published in September last year. Here we focused on currently prevailing issues and challenges for sustainability or responsible sourcing. We also looked at available standards and sustainability initiatives, and we defined a Vision 2050 that stands for the ultimate goal we want to achieve with our roadmap and in the renewable energy sector. The start of the roadmap development was made with the roadmap workshop, discussing the issues the roadmap needs to address and outlining a first timeline for the roadmap's milestones. The next step was the investigation of so-called flagship cases in the renewable energy sector. Flagship cases are good practice cases in industry or policymaking that support the implementation of responsible sourcing and offer guidance for peers and how to implement similar practices. The final stage of the roadmap development was an extensive consultation process with representatives of all stakeholder groups and many different regions. All recommendations included in the roadmap are based on the workshops or especially the consultation process. Okay, so what does the roadmap actually look like? Well, between the State of Play report and our Vision 2050, we defined 5 targets. By 2030, our targets are to create a level playing field, as well as social sustainability and responsible production in line with the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. By 2040, we have set the targets of achieving the Paris Agreement, environmental sustainability and responsible production, and also responsible procurement. This is much more ambitious than currently planned by the EU, but according to the stakeholders who contributed to this roadmap and various scientific studies, it is necessary. And last but not least, at the target of a circular economy and decreased resource consumption by 2050. The roadmap contains concrete recommendations for politics, industry, and civil society on how these targets can be achieved. I'm now going to introduce each target individually, and after each target, we will hear from one of our expert respondents. So starting with target 1, the circular economy and decreased resource consumption. Energy systems are currently the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. But at the same time, energy is, of course, crucial for economic and social development and is also embedded in the SDGs. So the transition to renewable energy can only be achieved by changing our consumption patterns if we want to avoid further harming the environment, further harming our planet. So this target is all about increasing resource efficiency, recycling, and reuse rates to cover growing demands. We also highlight the necessity of decreasing resource consumption and moving away from the continuous growth paradigm in the long run. As pointed out by various reports, for example, by the European Environmental Bureau, absolute decoupling is not going to be possible, thus making fundamental changes to our current economic system necessary. The milestones for achieving each target are divided into short, medium, and long-term milestones. As target 1 should be achieved by 2050, the short-term milestones, the longest milestones are, of course, also until 2050. So we have milestones for 2025, 2030, 2040, and finally 2050. The short-term milestones start with introducing concrete goals for the economy on energy consumption, implementing collection and recycling programs, or integrated sustainability accounting and reporting. With the increased duration, the milestones require more fundamental changes. By 2030, of course, the achievement of the SDGs relevant to this target are included, but also the introduction of policies to change the economic system. These changes are to be completed by 2050. Now, let's take a look at some concrete recommendations included in the roadmap. You can see here, we not only subdivided the recommendations according to time, but also according to stakeholder group and sector addressed. So a recommendation for policymakers for manufacturing is, for example, to introduce eco-design policies for solar PV modules and wind turbines. As I'm sure you know, the EU is already in the process of developing such policies for solar PV. So this is a continuation of these efforts. One of our recommendations for mining companies is to continuously modernize their machinery and their equipment to increase electrification and decrease energy intensity. The recommendations for civil society, research, and academia are not sequenced in the same way as for the other stakeholder groups, as we consider their role to be more overarching and actually supporting the achievement of all milestones. So for target 1, we ask of NGOs to help increase the awareness of impacts of consumption and possible alternatives. Research organizations should continue the development of new technologies with the focus on resource and energy efficiency. I would now like to hand over to Estelle for her statement on the roadmap and the role of the research community in achieving target 1. Estelle, the floor is yours.
Right, thank you. Well, I would say that decreasing resource consumption in itself is not a new target for the renewable energy sector. In PV, we have seen the silver use being divided by 3 over the last decade. There have been changes in manufacturing processes, which have led to more energy efficiency and substantial reduction in silicon waste during wafering, for instance. Wastewater recycling has also become quite standard in PV manufacturing plants. However, all of these improvements, resource efficiency measures, have mainly been driven by a motivation to reduce costs. So the objective was to make PV an economically viable option for future energy systems, and this objective has been achieved. So the question is, how do we move forwards? How do we achieve more ambition in sustainability, and why do we need to do so? Well, all energy systems modeling project a multi-terawatt scale for PV until 2050, so somewhere between 14 and 80 terawatt peak of PV until 2050. And at this kind of scale, every bit of resource consumption will add up and become substantial. So to give you an example, some colleagues of mine at the Fraunhofer Institute, led by Jan-Christoph Gottschmidt, published a paper recently where they showed that building the global PV infrastructure will consume up to 11% of the greenhouse gas emission budget that we have to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And this is true despite the well-established low carbon footprint of PV. So how can research especially help in addressing all of these challenges? Well, in a lot of ways, of course, but I would like to name two, especially today. The first one would be technological innovation. So we would need to develop more sustainable PV technologies. This means, for instance, low carbon emission technologies. So for instance, by turning towards more efficient cell designs, such as tandem cells. We also need to address criticality issues and mitigate these issues by implementing strategies such as diversifying trades, but also substituting all of these materials which have high supply risks. So this is the case for indium, for instance, in heterojunction cells. Circularity is, of course, a big topic. There is quite the acknowledgement in the PV sector that we need to move towards high-value recycling, and more importantly, a cost-efficient one, which is a challenge in itself because at the moment we have low PV waste volumes, which means that we don't benefit from economies of scale to establish this high-value recycling. As you mentioned, design for recycling, design for dismantling are also works in progress, as is increasing the share of recycled material during production. There is also the big data challenge. So we have this huge challenge ahead of us where we need to better understand our waste flows and our material consumption patterns along the entire value chain. Some people mention or name digitalization and blockchain technologies as a potential game changer here. So this is something that needs to be examined more precisely in the PV sector, for instance. And there is a second aspect that I would like to mention. This is more of a methodological one or conceptual one, if you will. We need to integrate values, sustainability values, already during the first stages of technology development. So this means looking at social risks, social benefits, criticality issues, environmental impacts, of course, economic issues related to the development of new technologies and related to the selection of new materials for these very innovative cell designs. And we need methodological tools to do so. Some of them are being developed. There is, for instance, the Life Cycle Sustainability Assessment, or LCSA, which is a work in progress. But on a higher level, I would say that such roadmaps are a good tool, are a good approach to provide guidelines to research, to guide all of these progresses in the matter of circularity and resource efficiency. And I think the resourcing roadmap catches quite well this really multidimensionality that we need to integrate and to move from costs orientation towards more sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Estelle. It's really great to hear about the ongoing efforts of the research community. And thank you also very much for raising this second point on creating value. And I think this is also something that is reflected quite well in the roadmap. So thank you for that. We are now moving on to target 2, the achievement of the Paris Agreement and environmental sustainability. In combination with the efforts in Target 1, we here push for the transition to 100% renewable energy and net zero emissions. This target also includes considerations on land use and biodiversity conservation related to the supply of renewable energy. Another focus of this target is the implementation of climate and environmental reporting, ecosystem impact assessments, and mandatory environmental performance audits. As Target 2 needs to be achieved by 2040, this is of course also reflected in the milestones that only extend until 2040. Again, the short-term milestones are supposed to pave the way for more substantial changes. Here we have the review of waste and land use policies to support recycling and the development of renewable energy projects. But also the achievement of the Aichi targets is included in these 2025 milestones. The medium to long-term milestones include ramping up renewable energy capacities, reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and finally, zero pollution of land, air, and sea. Apart from the specific recommendations for the considered supply chain stages, we also have a large general section with recommendations that are relevant for the entire renewable energy sector and all related supply chains. So for example, one of these general recommendations for policymakers is to improve the harmonization of environmental policies throughout the EU and to introduce coordinated reporting criteria. A general recommendation for industry would be the implementation of environmental and climate-related reporting in their operations and their entire supply chains. In the civil society section, we encourage local NGOs and community associations to cooperate with companies and governments and to provide their unique local expertise. Many of the recommendations included in the targets are then also explained in more detail. We provide examples, we provide standards or initiatives that could be implemented, for example. So for instance, for land use aspects, we show an example of co-use from an Austrian solar PV power plant with sheep farming. Or for climate and environmental reporting, we highlight the framework provided by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure and the upcoming framework on nature-related financial disclosures. Right, Raffaele, may I ask you for your comments on the roadmap and for providing us with an industry perspective?
Right, thank you, Marie-Thérèse, for the kind invite to join and speak at this conference. So first of all, I would like to say thanks for launching a publication that expands the state of knowledge on sustainability aspects in the renewable energy sector, which is for us very important areas to consider. You could argue that the key driver for deploying solar is to combat climate change, and therefore there is no surprise that the companies in the PV industry put a lot of emphasis on this. It is by all means one of the key selling points for our sector, indeed, which the industry is using to promote the use of solar as a sustainable energy source. So in our industry, carbon footprint reduction has been the #1 focus so far. Solar main contribution to sustainability is to decarbonize electricity generation in accordance, as you all know, to SDG 13, and considering the GHG emissions generated throughout the life cycle, solar produces at least 96% less GHG emissions than coal and 93% than gas. But still, PV does have a small but not negligible carbon footprint, as the previous speaker pointed out, could become quite substantial in light of the growth in order of magnitudes of solar PV capacity globally. So as you rightly pointed out in the roadmap, carbon footprint reduction in PV manufacturing is indeed a key action to improve sustainability in solar further. And importantly, this action is very often driven by the industry itself because of cost efficiency reasons in the first place, but also with a view to give a stronger sustainability profile to the PV products that the industry is selling. We published a few reports on sustainability features in the solar industry and identified a number of good practices for the industry to reduce carbon footprint. And these include, for example, minimizing energy consumption in the manufacturing process, but also using green electricity still in the manufacturing, reducing the amount of carbon intensive material, for example, aluminum, silicon, glass, and so on. It's important to see that this is actually happening already in the industry. The amount of silicon per watt has been decreasing by 75% over the course of the last 10 years. Same for silver, similar reduction patterns, and more is expected to be achieved in the industry. Extending product lifetime and in turn increasing the energy yield per kilowatt peak produced is another important activity, but also maximizing recycled content and circular practice are definitely very important aspects to look at. And these are all excellent practices to minimize the need of raw materials and decrease its environmental impacts. But then again, carbon footprint is one key feature when we talk about sustainability, but it's not the only one. And it is also important to address different sustainability issues beyond carbon footprint. And the SDG frameworks show how sustainability is a multifaceted concept, in fact, that need to take into account different environmental, social, and economic aspects. And this implies that sustainability consideration need to be made at all levels of the value chain, from raw material sourcing to module manufacturing, to the construction and installation of PV parks, as well as the end of life. And this consideration should address a variety of areas spanning from ecosystem preservation and biodiversity to sustainable supply chain and transparency, working condition across the value chain, but also inclusiveness for a diverse workforce, to name a few. And it's interesting that you mentioned in your introductory speech the reference to address topics such as biodiversity, land use, but also social acceptance for local communities. And I wanted to touch upon these areas because they are good examples of when solar energy can actually provide net benefits to environment and society. So when building large ground-mounted PV parks, we have identified several good practices that can lead to positive impacts to biodiversity and land use. The one you showed, it's an interesting picture, but let me elaborate a little bit on this. Industry guidelines have been prepared when it comes to best practices on biodiversity and land use in order to minimize the land use and enhance biodiversity, not only for sheep grazing, but also providing sanctuaries for flora and fauna, especially for those endangered species that could be affected by other uses of land. And another interesting trend is indeed agri-solar, so integration PV project within agricultural activities that can actually take several different forms, but essentially enables dual use of land and allows to develop synergies between the two economic activities. And further, at the planning and designing phase, we have seen the importance of involving municipalities and citizens at the early stage of solar project development. And this can be done in relation to creating benefits for the local communities, such as jobs, additional tax revenues for the local communities, but also to identify best suited areas for solar parks and how to best enhance biodiversity, as well as the cultural heritage of the region. So looking at the larger picture, we as a EU-focused trade association would like to see more ambition with regard to the EU decarbonization targets that are currently under discussion within the context of the revision of the Renewable Energy Directive. And we have seen a target of 40% renewable energy by 2030, currently proposed by the Commission, but we would like to see this target raised to at least 45%. And in our point of view, this would help accelerate the energy transition and also give industries like ours a further push to decarbonize at a faster rate. So I will stop it here, but before, let me thank you again for the publication of this study, and I look forward to the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Raffaele, thank you for your statement. You raised very good points here. I mean, there are already great industry initiatives, and I think these need to be supported and need to be taken to a much broader level. And also thank you for increasing the ambitions. I think this is exactly in line with our roadmap. Right, then let's move on to our next target, target 3, social sustainability and responsible production. This target really focuses on the social aspects of a just energy transition. The distribution of benefits and burdens associated with the transition need to be fairly distributed, and wrongdoings need to be addressed and restored in a suitable manner. The transparency of processes and operations, the involvement of affected communities, equal access to clean and affordable energy are only some of the aspects we tackle here. Also included is occupational health and safety, which of course play an important role in the renewable energy sector. The time frame of the milestones reflects the urgency of this target. So in line with the SDGs, this target needs to be achieved by 2030. The short-term milestones consider the achievement of gender and racial equality, as well as the integration of social life cycle assessments in product development. As already mentioned, until 2030, we of course have the achievement of the SDGs on the one hand, and on the other hand, the changes of the economic system that we address in target 1 are also reflected here, as businesses are required to put social and environmental considerations above their aim for maximum profit. Included recommendations for policymakers are the protection of human rights defenders, for example, that are especially vulnerable in the renewable energy sector. Also included is the review of occupational health and safety policies with a focus on the specific characteristics of wind turbine and solar PV manufacturing. In the civil society chapter, we address labor unions, with an example of the cooperation between Industry All and Siemens Gamesa, recommending them to monitor the adherence to ILO conventions, provide training programs, etc. The roadmap also includes excerpts of the good practice guidance, the flagship cases that I mentioned in the beginning. So here, the relevant good practice guidance contains information on setting up a multi-stakeholder process in the design phase of a mining policy, involving as many different stakeholders, as many different viewpoints as possible. Further information on these cases can then always be found in the good practice guidance document that was published in parallel with the roadmap. Isabel is now going to provide us with an NGO perspective on the roadmap and target 3. Isabel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marie-Thérèse. I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I work for the Just Energy Transition Program of Milieudefensie, which is the Dutch member of the International Friends of the Earth Federation. And I'm honored to speak here and to use this space to echo the many messages and valuable insights I have received from many brave activists in the Global South and also North. For many years, we've worked with Southern partners on a just transition, and for a long time, our work has focused on ending continuous and harmful fossil extraction in the Global South and really push for a transition to renewables. So let there be no doubt, as civil society, we all support a just and rapid transition away from from fossils towards a renewable energy system. But we also feel there are a lot of lessons to be learned from the fossil extractive system and where things went wrong. And that's not only in terms of the climate challenges that we face now and which people in the global south will bear a lot of the consequences of. Many of the southern partners we work with are very familiar with the fossil resource curse. And in the wake of the natural energy resources on their lands, the pollution came, human rights abuses, corruption, growing debt status, unfair trade rules, and lack of accountability for all of the above. So a lot of foreign states, including Western states and companies, have come to them with development rhetoric, promising jobs, promising better life, but these have never materialized. They continue to face poverty, and that includes energy poverty, despite the energy resources their countries have. And that is still a daily the reality they have to live with. So from this experience, I wanted to paint this background. Many of the partners have a very clear ideas on what a just and equitable transition to renewable energy should imply. So we really welcome the wording of just transition being integrated in the publication, and also some of the main goals in the roadmap that is about fair distribution of benefits and burdens across countries and populations, the focus on the SDGs, the need to include affected communities in all decision-making processes, and the need to avoid and correct injustices by governments and other institutions. Several of the ways forward to meet this goal resonate with our own, and on some we propose going a bit of a step further. So first of all, we've already addressed it earlier. To reduce pressure on the global south, the EU will need to address its resource consumption. And that means really reducing its material footprint by 2050 to stay with a safe operating space. We use a lot of the metals that are going to be and minerals that are going to be needed for the transition. There's a high import dependency, and that means a lot of the countries in the global south are going to face the risk of ending up as stones of sacrifice for our renewable and digital energy demands. And that can be addressed by the EU moving away from green growth thinking, by regulating disposable consumption, a big focus on private transportation, the digitalization of everything towards more equitable access to services and low carbon public transit. It also means prioritizing circular economy solutions as to reduce the overall demand for primary metals. And when investing in the reuse, recycling, and design for this assembly, that needs to be happening both within the EU, but also outside of the EU. So it should be done with the highest environmental, health, and labor standards, and also based on fully and informed community consent. Next, the EU also must recognize and protect and ensure the role of communities and indigenous people in all processes, as your report rightly states. So stakeholder engagements need strengthening so that they're really bottom up and participatory, and communities can be part of the decisions that are going to affect them. And that means prioritizing and not just considering the right to free, prior, and informed consent, and also communities' right to say no to mining. Communities need to have the right to be protected also from harassment and pressures, and to freely express concerns and demands about a project or a company that they may have. And this is particularly important because we really can see a rise of repercussions against communities and NGOs that resist or speak out against mining harmful practices. As your report also states, mining industries need to integrate human rights management systems in their operations. And although several companies are already making use of internationally recognized standards and frameworks, we also see that standards and voluntary measures in reality regularly do not prove to be enough to prevent human rights abuses. They can easily end up being merely process-oriented or become a tick-of-the-box exercise when they're not combined with liability provisions for harm caused. So for due diligence to really work, it needs to be accompanied with strong enforcement and also sanction mechanisms. It must be made possible to hold corporations in general, and including mining corporations, to account for harms caused via mandatory EU due diligence legislation. Access to justice and remedy for victims in due diligence legislation is really important so that victims can seek justice in EU courts if required, and not only need to rely on grievance mechanisms. And lastly, the report underlines the importance of capacity building for local communities with a focus on long-lasting developments, also after a project has closed. And yes, this is really important. But what our Southern partners also state is that we need to build the capacities of the countries and communities whose lands are used so they can also benefit from the natural resources they hold. And that goes beyond foreign companies creating decent or transition jobs in new sectors or just investing in local development projects. Rather than treating, regulating, and making policies about minerals and metals as if they are only sources of capital to be extracted, processed, and sold, they also need to become common goods so that the people can have democratic control over their natural resources and energy. And our partners often use the term energy colonialism and even are starting to speak about renewable energy colonialism if Western industries and foreign industries and states continue guarding and managing their energy resources and economies through trade and economic policies. And basically what they say, the many economic gains from the natural resources these countries hold are often not compensated for by means of taxes, royalties, jobs, and other multipliers that are flowing back to the nations and the communities. There are also mechanisms like ISDS that make it very difficult for countries if they want to back their local communities that might wish to say no to mining. Many countries in the global south also face that status, and that also increases pressure on them, especially those that depend primarily on resource extraction, does not really enable them to have sovereignty over their economic policies. And low import tariffs and high export tariffs on exported goods also restrict countries in the global south. So for example, when it comes to expanding their own processing in their own countries. So it also means having more control over the resources that they have and being able to not only provide and cater for parts of the world that are going to use them, but also be able to benefit from it themselves. And yeah, as I've said before, many countries in the global south right now that have fossil resources are still living in energy poverty. So a just and equitable transition to renewables means addressing also unfair trade and investment rules that continue to uphold North-South inequity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isabel, and thank you very much for bringing this perspective of the Global South into the discussion. And you already touched upon that our recommendations for policymakers especially aim at the EU. But what we keep highlighting throughout the report and throughout our work is how important it is to consider the effects EU policies have on other countries, on the countries supplying the raw materials that we need for our transition. So thank you very much for that. Okay, then on to target 4, responsible procurement. While our working definition for responsible sourcing is currently this very broad consideration of sustainability along the entire supply chain, the responsible procurement target focuses on the purchasing processes and decisions of an organization. So with its purchasing decisions, an organization needs to take societal and environmental aspects into account to create value wherever possible. This also means engaging with business partners that currently don't meet expectations to help build capacity. So this target focuses on supply chain due diligence, including transparency and, if possible, even traceability of raw materials and products. It also focuses on the resilience of supply chains in the light of black swan events such as COVID. The time frame is again until 2040. And you might think there is a slight deviation from the EU aspirations for supply chain due diligence, but in fact, we also have the implementation of mandatory supply chain due diligence as a milestone until 2030 for large international players as planned by the EU. But additionally, we added the requirement operating organizations, regardless of their size, by 2040, and accompanying measures to assist the implementation by SMEs in the meantime. This target only includes recommendations for policymakers and industry. And while we mainly focus on supply chain due diligence and respective legal and control mechanisms, this target also includes recommendations on supporting local procurement, including the possibility for inner European mining. Policymakers are advised to support responsible mining in the EU to avoid the shifting of burdens to other countries. As already mentioned, this target also considers supply chain resilience. So recommendations for industry include the risk assessment of supply chains regarding strategic vulnerabilities to decrease the risk for disruptions as we have experienced it in recent times. We will now hear another expert statement on the roadmap and the role of international organizations. So Ben, may I ask you to come in here?
Thanks, Marie-Therese. Yeah, very happy to speak here, and thanks for the invitation and just the continued involvement in the resourcing project, which is really doing so much to bring more attention to a lot of these important issues around responsible sourcing and production for the energy transition. I just wanted to set the scene a little bit here with some data points that I think Marie-Therese, certainly the report, the roadmap touches on. Not sure why the bottom half of this graph isn't really rendering. Oh, there we go. Yeah, in terms of the projected demand, the need to source metals, different kinds of metals, in particular, what we're increasingly calling critical minerals and metals to support the energy transition. You can see in both parts of this graph just the additional amounts of metals that are required in renewable energy products. This is from the report INSET in the lower right-hand corner, published earlier this year by the International Energy Agency. And we can move to the next slide. And then similarly, you can see for particular metals on the right-hand side, this is the degrees of magnitude of additional amounts of these metals that we'll need in order to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. In particular, lithium, graphite, cobalt, and nickel. They're really off the chart in terms of demand. And we can move to the next slide. And to highlight where a lot of these metals come from, everything in these bars, except for the green sections, are countries, sources that provide, that produce these metals that have low governance scores or very high emissions or both. And so those are really challenges in terms of how we address, how we create responsible supply chains to source the metals we need in order to accomplish the energy transition. And we can move to the next slide. So just to add some context to the role of due diligence and responsible business conduct and how we achieve many of the solutions called for by the roadmap. I think, that as Marie-Therese just touched on, there's sort of these two themes as we see it. We see a need to maintain security of supply to sort of anticipate those black swan events, as well as other kinds of disruptions that may happen more frequently, but also to do so in a way that brings about a just transition. So where producing and trading communities are respected, their voices are taken into account, where natural resources actually contribute to development rather than pose an obstacle to it. And so what we increasingly see, where we see the narrative moving and we think is a practical direction, is that we need to maintain a diverse set of sources for these metals, not only because we can't relocate where reserves are, but also because if done right, if companies are appropriately carrying out due diligence, human rights due diligence, as well as on corruption and environment, and stay engaged responsibly in high-risk areas, and including with informal workers, that can go a long way to making natural resources play a positive role in development. And one way to do this, an important way to do this, as we see it, is to use the established OECD standards on responsible sourcing, on supply chain due diligence, indicated, shown here on the bottom of the slide, and which can help both anticipate risks and potential disruptions in supply chains, as well as mitigate the risk of adverse impacts on people, planet, and society. Also, just wanted to touch on the issue of recycling. Obviously, that's going to play an increasingly important role as well to minimize the environmental footprint of a lot of these supply chains. But it also poses, I think, the question of responsible exit as we do move away from primary production in some supply chains. But at least we do have the luxury of planning in some sense for that responsible exit and sketching out what that looks like to help transition communities away from reliance on natural resources. And we can move to the next slide. Just a couple slides here on the due diligence framework in the OECD standards. It's in the minerals guidance. It's a 5-step framework on management systems, on identifying risks, on managing them appropriately, verifying due diligence through audits, and communicating annually on one's due diligence. In the due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct, which is cross-sectoral, there's a 6th step on remedy. Typically in the minerals guidance, this is integrated into step 3, and we can move to the next slide. One of the ways in which the minerals guidance distinguishes itself from other supply chain standards is its kind of unique due diligence framework that maps onto the specific stages of the minerals value chain. And this is something that we think can help clarify due diligence obligations for companies at different stages of the supply chain. Traceability and other technology solutions aren't necessarily a panacea in all cases. They can play a role, but figuring out what companies' due diligence obligations are, depending on where they are in the supply chain, can help answer that question. And we can move to the next slide, the final slide here. Just wanted to give a brief, some data points here on research we've carried out on uptake of the OECD due diligence guidance on mineral supply chains for a forthcoming paper. And these are, we established indicators that we measured performance by 500 companies in mineral supply chains across the world on the different steps of the minerals guidance. We show here results from 2014, 2018 of companies and producing minerals, and also further on in the value chain, how they did against these indicators in the EV sector compared to indicated by the red dots, the average. So actually the EV sector is doing a little bit better than average, but there's really a ways to go in particular on steps 2 and 3. And those are really the touch points, identifying risks and responding to them in producing and trading countries and communities. So companies are doing a better job on establishing policies on due diligence, to some extent on reporting and auditing, but on actually substantively how they respond to those risks they identify. That's a major shortcoming. And that's also where communities can most benefit from due diligence. So that's really where we'd like to see more progress. Again, very pleased to be part of the roadmap process. We do think it's important keeping those milestones, those dates in mind, that we don't grow complacent. This is a process, also as the workshop earlier this year on incentives and drivers of due diligence pointed out, that it can be a long process. And as we can see in these results as well, it takes a while for even legislation or other incentives to really trickle down and bring about widespread, scaled up implementation of due diligence, of supply chain due diligence. So we think to meet the goals established in the roadmap, we really need to step up progress as soon as possible. We're trying to do this increasingly through outreach directly to companies, but also through industry associations, pushing industry associations and voluntary initiatives to really hold their members accountable for their commitments to due diligence, and also looking at trying to advise on the legislation that is emerging so that it's aligned with these established standards. So I'll leave it there. Thanks again, and really interested in how we can collectively move this forward.
Thank you very much for your statement, Ben, and for providing these highly relevant insights. I can only echo your call for engagement. I think this is probably one of the words used most often throughout our roadmap. Yeah, and also you mentioned the OECD guidances. They are, of course, included in the roadmap as one of those major frameworks that need to be implemented by all stakeholders. Thank you very much. Let me just share the presentation again. So we will now move on to our final target, the level playing field. And from the very beginning of our consultation process, it became clear that we need to include a specific section on the development of a level playing field to ensure, or rather to enable, sustainability along the supply chains. Currently, our system favors the production of the cheapest products, rather than products that ensure high quality and durability and take social and environmental aspects into account. So this target focuses on two main areas: same rules for all and assistance to those who need help in achieving certain standards. As you can imagine, even though this is a very ambitious target and this target will definitely pose significant challenges, it is also needed to ensure that other targets can be achieved. So we again have this short time frame until 2030 only. The milestones include border tax adjustments, extended producer responsibility, as well as the harmonization of standards and reporting criteria. The recommendations evolve around international cooperation to harmonize requirements for policymakers or for companies to stop trying to evade strict environmental and social standards by applying the same high level of standards in all countries of operation. We also address international organizations such as the UN or OECD, and suggest the implementation of an international judiciary for companies to make it easier to hold companies accountable for any social or environmental damages caused along the supply chains. For this target, I would like to ask our last expert of this session, Maria, for her statement and providing us with the policy perspective. Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marie-Thérèse. I'd like to highlight the following items. In your recommendations, you talk about the need to involve civil society for sustainable and responsible supply chains, to bring all stakeholder groups on board, to cooperate and involve local communities on the need for development of raw material projects for the rollout of renewable energy. These recommendations are welcome. What we see is a need to dialogue with the public on the conditions at which sustainable raw materials extraction, processing and recycling takes place in Europe. This is important to increase awareness and knowledge about their importance for the green and digital transition. One of the inputs to this dialogue is the EU Principles for Sustainable Raw Materials that we have developed together with member states and other stakeholders. We published them in September. This is a voluntary, non-mandatory set of principles for sustainable raw materials in Europe, and they build on the extensive EU acquis legislation and address social, economic governance and environmental aspects aligning with the Sustainable Development Goals. They support circular economy and resource efficiency-driven mineral-based technology value chains, and the ambition is that they can show the way in which extraction and processing in the EU is carried out in a sustainable manner. You further talk about the need to support SMEs to pick up on responsible sourcing. Here I want to mention the multilingual EU portal Due Diligence Ready that we have set up to help industry perform supply chain due diligence to source minerals and metals responsibly and, if applicable, comply with regulatory requirements in the Responsible Minerals Regulation. This portal, this tool, Due Diligence Ready, is designed for SMEs because performing supply chain due diligence is still a time-consuming process where large companies are better placed to find necessary resources than SMEs. And we will further develop this portal to take into account future legislative developments such as the forthcoming batteries regulation. Third point, you referred to the need to work towards the achievement of the SDGs on a global level with effective international cooperation. As pointed out in the Critical Raw Materials Action Plan that we set forward 1 year ago, we are setting up strategic partnerships to diversify supply with sustainable and responsible sourcing from third countries. To ensure the raw materials we source from third countries are sustainable, the free trade agreements include ambitious trade and sustainable development chapters, and the sustainability dimension will continue to be reflected in many other aspects of the EU's trade and investment agreements. So as of now, we have set up partnerships with Canada and Ukraine. We are talking with other areas as well, such as the Western Balkans, countries on the African continent. And these partnerships are about integration of sustainable raw materials value chains between the EU and the partner country, cooperation on research and innovation to make the raw materials value chains greener, cleaner, and more resource efficient. And it's also about environmental, social, and governance criteria. Fourth point, you refer to the EU supply chain due diligence law. Just to clarify that the sustainable corporate governance, which is the equivalent legislative initiative, is to come up still during this year, and it will have a horizontal due diligence duty requiring EU companies to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for sustainability impacts in terms of environmental harm and human rights violation in their own operations and supply chains. For your further work, I'd like to draw your attention to a recent initiative. You may have heard of the European Raw Materials Alliance. And a couple of weeks ago, this Raw Materials Alliance called out for a number of actions needed to secure access to rare earth magnets and motors for European industry going green and digital. And the Raw Materials Alliance is asking for more transparency and sustainability, and is asking for the EU to promote ethical sourcing and transparency in the rare earths value chain by 2025, and that original equipment manufacturers should track their supply chain and provide certified information in the production of rare earth magnets and motors. So I think that it could be important for the resourcing consortia to also closely take a look at this. And then I finally wanted to mention an event that is coming up next week on the 18th of November. It is a seminar that we are doing together with partners in Canada, Natural Resources Canada on the tracing of sustainable battery minerals. So please sign up for this event on the 18th of November if you would see an interest. That was what I wanted to highlight here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria, for providing this EU perspective. And it was actually really interesting throughout our work on the renewable energy sector to see how many initiatives are currently under development or are currently being published. So I think there's a lot going on right now. Well, thank you to all of our experts actually again for their statements, and thank you for your attention. Masuma, I hand back over to you.
Thank you very much, Marie-Therese, and that was quite a lot of information. And I think as the resourcing project was also going through the process of developing this roadmap, this question of balance of responsibility, balance of burden, who needs to change, who needs to do what. And that has been a very interesting and not a simple conversation. I would encourage everyone who has the time. We have an informal exchange at the end of the day. Please join that link so you can ask Marie-Therese and the rest of the team and our experts more questions related to what this roadmap has been saying. But thank you very much. Now, as Marie-Therese is relieved of her duties towards a roadmap for the resourcing project, Johannes Betts, our next speaker, is just starting their responsibilities towards devising a roadmap for the mobility sector. The mobility sector is kind of halfway there. We're still developing the roadmap and the workshops for it, but Johannes is going to take the opportunity to talk about the work that has been already done under this heading. Johannes is Dr. Johannes, as I should call him. He has a PhD in chemistry, and he specializes in electromobility, resource consumption. He's our guy to tell us everything about lithium-ion batteries when we need to find out more about this. And he's very well placed to tell us what that roadmap is starting to look like. Johannes, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. You should see my presentation by now. Yes, perfect. It's the pleasure today to introduce you to our work for the mobility sector. And as time is running, I dive right into it. So we started our roadmap process for the mobility sector with the State of Play, which we published in 2021 in April this year. And this is a comprehensive report, which is published, as I said, on the project website. And it covers the information about the key players in the selected global battery value chain steps, as well as the challenges, standards, and initiatives, the vision to 2050, and a first gap analysis. To briefly summarize these, the transformation of in the mobility sector is needed to limit climate change, as the battery electric vehicle is the key component for lithium-ion battery. And the most promising technology today to actually achieve this goal, we agreed on focusing on the lithium-ion battery value chain, which you can see here. And for this lithium-ion battery value chain, we focused on 3 certain steps: the mining, the cell production, where also the OEMs are involved, and the recycling step. We did this not only together with our team, the project team, but also with the advisory board and the platform steering committee from our project. For lithium-ion battery, in the mining step, we focused on 4 different elements, which were already mentioned today as very important for the future: lithium, cobalt, nickel, and graphite. And we then presented the information for each of these materials. First of all, we looked into the production itself, so where it takes place, in which countries, and which global players are involved. And with a further step, also always looking at Europe itself. And in the end, always the environmental and the social challenges were addressed for each of the 4 materials. For the cell production, we looked at the technical process itself, explained it, and then again looked where it takes place and which of the players are involved. In the third step, the recycling, also the technical status was provided. Furthermore, we looked into where the recycling plants are at the moment, which amounts of batteries they can recycle, and which different technologies they use. And of course, in the end, again, challenges of the recycling were discussed. Furthermore, we have grouped the diverse landscape of different standards and initiatives, and always looked again on the 3 different steps, where we've seen that there are a lot of standards and initiatives for the mining sector, but not so much for cell production and recycling. In the end, a first gap analysis was conducted, where 6 steps were identified in the areas of global level playing field, global due diligence, responsible procurement, lithium-ion battery recycling, resource efficiency, harmonization of sustainability requirements. And we also conducted, as I said before, a vision. We also focused on the 3 value steps, but also on overarching objectives, and we separated them in environmental, social, and economic objectives. So this, the roadmap process itself started with a brainstorming workshop in the end of October. And there we had a very interesting discussion with actors from all over the world, again, focusing on the 3 working groups: mining, cell production, and recycling. To summarize this shortly, you can see here that we have mirror boards where most of the objectives were actually put into the near future, which means we have to act now. And we also need overarching targets and very specific ones, like we discussed here, transparency through the entire value chain. Furthermore, which was mentioned as very important, were independent reviews to build up trust and acceptance. Furthermore, the reduction of energy consumption is very important, and the use of renewable energy. The question is only, when can we actually achieve 100% renewable energy throughout the value chain? Furthermore, the development of a fair value chain is very important, which also leads to sustainable local development. And you have to think about circular economy from the beginning. So if you develop a product like a battery, thinking about the end of the battery is very important. So design for recycling was discussed as well. In the end, communication is necessary, especially as the different players have to communicate their needs and their problems with each other. This were the issues which came up during the brainstorming last week. But of course, we also had some issues in our mind we would like to discuss in our roadmap development for the future. Looking again at the 3 different sectors. First, the issues in mining, with a focus on Europe. We asked ourselves, how much is there actually on material which can be mined for lithium-ion batteries in the EU, and could the EU at least partly sustain itself by mining its materials itself? And again, is it possible that in 2050 mining projects in Europe will be discussed more openly? Furthermore, mining in general, the local development is very important. So what strategies are actually needed to support long-term and sustainable development at mine sites? Furthermore, the harmonization of standards and initiatives. As I said before, there are many different standards and initiatives. So the question is, how can these be harmonized? And in the end, the and small scale mining, how can and the formalization of this be supported, and also the cooperation between ASM and large scale mining be improved or strengthened. Looking at the cell production step, the second step, the renewable energy transition is very important. So the question is, can we actually reach it by 2040 for the cell production, as it's very energy intensive? Can the cells itself be designed for recycling, and how can this be strengthened? The purchasing is very important. So how can we achieve that all primary raw materials which enter the cell production are actually certified by a strong standard, for example, like IRMA? And how can we achieve that also these materials again have to undergo due diligence? The local development is also important in this step. So what strategies are needed to support long-term and sustainable development? Going to the last step, the recycling. There, the question lies a lot also on the export of lithium-ion batteries, which are exported to, kind of get rid of them in some parts. And the question is, what kind of strict criteria for exporting used batteries in vehicles are necessary? So is it actually allowed to export batteries? And if it's allowed, do we have criteria like must not be damaged, minimum residual capacity, something else, as when batteries are exported just to get rid of them, we will have problems in other countries. And as there are no real recycling plants at the moment, at least on the African continent, for example, the question is, how can the EU support a construction of recycling plants in target countries, for example, by research and development, staff, know-how, and also financial support. Words which came up during our discussion was the Circular Battery Research Center, or a competence network for this. Furthermore, as I told you earlier, recycling standards are not really there at the moment. Nevertheless, recycling can be a huge issue concerning health and safety, and also waste management. So what kind of recycling standards are needed for this? I skipped the battery regulation. The question is, what recovery quotas are actually needed to strengthen recycling and get to the point where we want to be? And in the end, again, the local development. So this was a roadmap brainstorming workshop. Here we are today. The next step are the stakeholder consultation and writing together the roadmap and presenting it to the public to again discuss these targets, and hopefully being able to publish it by summer 2022 next year. Parallel to that, we also have flagship cases which we already and mostly contacted and started to validate. The flagship lab for this, so the good practice examples where they are presented to peers, will hopefully take place in beginning early of 2022, which will then end up in the good practice guidance document and resulting also as an input for the roadmap in the end. That's everything from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Johannes. As you guys can see, this is an ongoing process. Please do get in touch with Johannes and his team and the wider resourcing team through our webpage. There are contact details available there. The presentations from Marie-Therese and Johannes will be available in the resources bit of your online conference panel. And there's also other material there, so please take a look at that. Tobias, who was our moderator yesterday and who was German, apologized for being late. I'm from a different culture, so timing is a little bit, not seriously taken, but my apologies. Ursula, back to you.
Thank you very much, Masuma, and thanks to all the experts that were talking. Yeah, it's hard to plan sometimes, and there were so many interesting inputs that took a little bit longer than expected, but never mind. With this conference, we try to contribute to a positive development in the area of resourcing. If you want to contribute to the development of our work, could you please fill in the survey? There is a little survey on the conference website for you to fill in a couple of seconds. And with this, I would like to announce a short break. Let's give all of us a break until 10:40. So let's get back until 10:40 and Masuma will continue with the panel discussion then. Enjoy your coffee or tea. See you later. Welcome back, everyone, to this conference. The big advantage of a virtual conference is that we can reach people from all over the world. The other thing is that we never know who is in and who's out at the moment. So I want to welcome you. If you're new to the conference, this is the second day of our conference. And the panel discussion is ahead of us, an interesting one. You can always participate via Slido and be part of the discussion if you're on the button live streaming. So I can give back to Masuma Farouki, who has been the facilitator in the morning already, and she will continue to facilitate the panel discussion ahead of us. She's a development economist who has worked in the sustainability field and extractive sector for over 10 years. And her focus is on measuring the socioeconomic impact of the resource sector and developing frameworks for the implementation of responsible mining practices. May I hand over to Masuma again and ask her to start with our panel discussion on procurement.
Thank you very much, Ursula. Part of being in this field for more years than I care to admit to is we've talked about standards and things that need to be done for a very long time. I sometimes feel like we're having the conversations again and again and again. And in the previous session, Marie-Therese laid out this wonderful roadmap of things that need doing. In this panel, we're going to look at the other side of this coin, which is what is actually being done. If we've been talking about responsible sourcing practices, procurement, how development needs to take place, and all these responsibilities, is it just talk, or are we actually progressing on these issues, and how far away are we? Now, to discuss that, I have four brilliant people to speak with, who most of them have been part of this journey with me. Some have done this longer. And so we're slightly old hacks at talking about implementation issues and how when reality actually matters, what that reality looks like. So to talk about procurement in practice and implementation, I have a wonderful panel, and I'm going to start off with introducing Amr Shafi, who I met at a UNDP conference, and we had a lovely conversation about the cynicism that is part of our jobs. Amr comes from the NRGI. NRGI, for those of you who've been following their index, have been doing country assessments related to natural resources, both for mining, oil, and gas. Their index is one of the most often quoted index on governances, and they talk about the country context and how the legislation and the government and the regulations and the implementation work and how far that gap is. I am then joined by Jeff. Again, we've met at a number of conferences. If I go to a major conference, I can be sure Jeff is there, and we joke about his travel budget all the time. Jeff has been interestingly talking about procurement at a point when most people had not started on this issue. He's with the nonprofit organization called Engineers Without Borders. And Jeff has been working with the World Bank, with GIZ, with BGR, and he looks at procurement practices on the ground between mining companies, local communities, and how that implementation and standards and all of that has actually happened over the years. Our third panelist is Jonas, who I am new to, but I have seen his CV and I'm like, here's the person who I really need to be speaking to. Currently working with the International Labour Organization, Jonas has also worked with the large mining companies as part of their sustainability efforts. So he has this viewpoint on both sides of the coin. And I like having the ILO on this, because if you look at ILO conventions, they're some of the oldest and most established conventions on labor rights, on procurement rights, on health issues. And some of them date from the 1980s, and we're still reinventing them, which makes me concerned about why has the ILO work not been taken more seriously. Our last panelist is Marie-Therese. I can sort of say she's the young addition to our panel, sort of, drops our average age. But Marie-Therese has spent 2 years talking to people in the renewable energy sector. And she's talked to not only just the extraction side, but the smelting and the recycling side. And she's aware of these standards that sometimes do not cross nodular boundaries within a value chain. And her experience on where standards are towards implementation and whether there's a disconnect or merge going on across the value chain in itself. So introductions done, let's get on to the interesting bit about the about our panel today, which is focusing on the implementation that is required to support a green transition. I am going to start off with Amir, and I'm just going to say, in the years that you've been doing this, when it comes to the implementation of responsible sourcing practices, particularly from a government perspective, where do you think we are on a scale of maybe 1 to 10, when 10 is great? Where are we currently located?
Thanks very much, Masuma, for the kind introduction and for the invitation to join the resourcing conference. You're speaking to a lawyer, so usually I would say, you want me to give you numbers. I don't do numbers. It just so happens, as you kindly said, the NRGI, the organization I've been working for a while now, does do an index. So I do have some numbers to give you. But let me start with a more provocative answer first. One, I would say there's a bit of an NA answer, not applicable answer, that might be appropriate, at least from the perspective that we look at things, that is from the kind of developing country producer perspective and the challenges that they face. What we see is that some of those core governance issues aren't sufficiently part of the discussion, right? That's to say, when we talk about responsible sourcing, we talk a lot about traceability, we talk a lot about compliance. There's less still, and I know in the conference I've had the fortune of listening to aspects of or parts of the conference, and it has been hit on, but the real need to get the core governance of the sector and even more broadly of the country right in order to actually advance on responsible sourcing. So I think especially on issues of anti-corruption and core sector governance, the field at times can be kind of missing it on the agenda. It's there, everyone knows it's there. Everyone reads the stories on the front pages of what happens in different countries and different scandals, but it's not sufficiently part of even the debate when we talk about responsible sourcing. So that's one answer. The other answer is more practical. And that one, unfortunately, is there's still a long ways to go. We are in the process of coming out with our kind of thematic report around the new index, the Resource Governance Index 2021. We've come out with the country scores. I can tell you some of the conclusions. One of them is that if you look at a place like the DRC, very relevant to this conversation, if I had to do it on a scale of 10 rather than 100 that we usually use, the most recent score in the mining sector is 3.6. Right. So there's a ways to go. And what do we measure? We measure especially things that we think are quite important for sector governance and the kind of transparency and accountability and anti-corruption elements. Right. So that's if you snapshot on one country. If you took a look at all of our mining assessments, which in this case, this year is a smaller index with focus on our priority countries of 14, it's around 5.5. Right. So better than the DRC, to be expected, a very challenging environment, but still not particularly good. Not even better than the oil and gas sector, so or not much at least, and that's something that obviously these sectors compete in different ways, including on the governance side. If we're going to zoom in on some particular issues that I say are not sufficiently on the agenda in these conversations, say on the anti-corruption side, on beneficial ownership, so knowing who actually owns assets, and whether there are issues with politically exposed persons and corruption risk, again, you're in the ballpark of 5. Maybe even lower actually. And what we notice on things like that, on beneficial ownership disclosure, on contract disclosure, so we know what the terms are that countries are actually signing up for, we do notice a very significant implementation gap, right? This is something we noted in our last index in 2017. It's something that continues to be an issue. So why don't I stop there just to give you both the kind of more provocative NA answer and a few numbers to play around with.
That 3.5 was a scary number, but I'm not surprised. I think with the DRC, the conversation revolves around Glencore and artisanal mining, and people don't step back and look at the country statistics and the governance statistics, which nicely brings me to Jonas, because the ILO conventions legally are supposed to be signed up to by governments. Now, I've read so many reports where companies say, oh, we follow the ILO conventions, but they're not legal signatories in my, it's the governments that need to sign up to this and then enforce them. But Jonas, given that you've done both sides of the coin, optimism, not applicable, we're all damned. Where would you start with?
Well, thank you very much, Masuma. I'm an eternal optimist, as you'll soon find out. And I like your question, because you're looking for a straightforward answer to a very complex question. And this is important. And such answers are powerful, both in terms of communicating, a need for action, and to make people realize that an issue needs attention. And I will, however, at least for now, resist the temptation to give you a number from 1 to 10. But I'll give you some other numbers. So in the world, as we speak today, right this very moment, 160 million children, 63 million girls, and 97 million boys are in child labor. And that's account for 1 in 10 of all children worldwide. Nearly half of these children, 79 million, are in hazardous work. In addition to this, 25 million people are right now trapped in forced labor. 16 million of those are exploited in the private sector, in domestic work, construction, agriculture, fishing, mining, etc. 4.8 million are in forced sexual exploitation, and 4 million people are in forced labor imposed by state authorities. It's depressing. I'll just go on for a little bit longer. 2.3 million women and men around the world die from work-related accidents and diseases every year. And furthermore, there are about 340 million occupational accidents and 160 million victims of work-related illnesses every year. So coming back to your question, how are we doing on a scale from 1 to 10? Well, if I can interpret your question as how good are we, as in the collective we, humankind, at using trade and value chains as a tool to address these issues, then I'm afraid that we still have a very, very long way to go. And that said, the optimist in me comes back. Some companies, some organizations, and some countries are pathfinders and have made good progress. And I've been lucky enough to work for some of these pathfinders, and I'll give you more examples during the panel discussion as we proceed. But so you're not going to get a number of 1 to 10 out of me, but I gave you some other numbers. Thank you.
Excellent. So I've had the lawyer say no, I've had the ILO expert say no. Marie-Therese, as an engineering mind, do you feel like giving me a number or?
Yes, I'm all for numbers. And actually, I thought I'm going to be the pessimistic one, but turns out I'm not. I would actually say we are on 3 to 4. And this 3 to 4 is not because we are actually implementing something, but because so much work in terms of standards and frameworks and guidance has already been done. And there is just so much guidance out there and on what we can do to actually achieve responsible sourcing. And I mean, I'm referring to responsible sourcing as this very broad consideration of sustainability in the supply chain. But yeah, coming back to the implementation, I think we are nowhere near a successful or wide uptake of these standards and references. I mean, just looking at the most basic things, such as the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, it's really staggering to me that so many companies, looking at the renewable energy sector now, have not implemented that yet. This is just shocking to me. And something that really annoyed me during our research for the renewable energy sector, so many companies highlight on their website, we are doing this, this, and this for responsible sourcing, and we are being so sustainable. But from what we found, responsible sourcing right now is merely a de-risking in the sense of avoiding practices that could potentially harm the reputation of a company and therefore harm the shareholder value. This means leaving out suppliers that currently don't meet expectations. That means disengaging and so on. So there's still such a long way to go to get to responsible sourcing in terms of creating value. And I think this is where we need to get, and this is also what we heard in discussions yesterday.
I feel like we're going to have a very depressing discussion on a cold morning. But Jeff, let me turn to you, because you're one of the few organizations that actually attempted to create a manual on local procurement and also how to measure it, so we could benchmark across countries to sort of get a greater idea And I've always found you to be a slightly more cheerful person than I am. Is there anything good to be said?
Yeah, I'm going to give a low number, but I'm going to stress that it's an improvement. So I'm going to say we're about a 3.5 or a 4, but I would say we're up from a 2 literally only 3 years ago. What I would say is the lack of implementation is the issue. There are no consequences for not implementing. We've had the OECD M&E guidelines for decades now, and yet the national contact points, as an example, don't function virtually at all in most countries, particularly certainly in Canada, where I'm from originally. But I would say on the positive side that we've seen more kind of movement in the last 2 or 3 years than ever before. I mean, there on a few fronts. One is that the investors are asking, and it won't take very much for that to click over into actual movement. I mean, they really, right now, they may be asking, and perhaps you could argue that people are not actually fulfilling those commitments that they make to investors, but it wouldn't take very much for those investors to actually start really looking in and demanding changes, and they would get them. And we've already seen that's happening. The other point is legally, we've had a few high-profile cases where companies have been sued for actions overseas and for actions in the supply chains. Now, I think these lawsuits are a result of both companies and governments in the north not getting ahead of this. I mean, we've had many companies complain about whether they don't want to have an ombudsperson or these kinds of systems, but the lack of those systems is resulting in court cases. And so, for example, in Canada, we had a Vancouver-based mining company who purchased labor from purchased construction services from a supplier in Eritrea, and they had slave labor in the company, and that went all the way to the Canadian Supreme Court. And I'll tell you what, that moved things in Canada very quickly. So that's not ideal. We shouldn't be at the stage where court cases are what's driving behavior change, but we are seeing the first sort of steps of legalistic governance, I suppose, for these supply chains. And I think we are getting somewhere. So yes, I'll say a 4, but with the potential to go to a 6 very quickly if we just play our cards right.
I knew it would be helpful to have a Canadian on this panel. You guys are cheerful, just generally. But let me bring this back to Amar then, because most of the time when we talk about responsible sourcing, there are company standards and are you signed up to ICMM or whatever, but country governments are signed up to the UN SDGs, which is a comprehensive standard in itself. My question to you is, in the countries that you're looking at, do you feel like this is a question of political will? Is it about capacity? Because implementation also needs resources. You can design a labor code. If you do not have the government capacity to monitor, evaluate, and implement, then having a lovely code makes absolutely no difference. And so my question to you is, do you think it's just saying, oh yeah, nice UN conference, we'll sign whatever needs signing? Or is there actual implementation issues which nobody's really addressing on the government side?
Well, a couple of things. One, I don't want to be the eternal pessimist. Lawyers always get that. One thing I forgot to mention is that 3.6, but previous index, it was a 3.3, right? Which, again, you're in the 3s, but if you look at it from a percentage improvement type of situation, you're seeing improvement. And this is, we can throw around numbers. I'm talking, obviously this index is based on actual policies and some implementation of those policies. So let's put that in perspective. And overall, there has been a trend towards improvement, especially of the legal framework. What we've seen actually, because we divide, for example, legal framework and practice, we see that the legal framework has improved, practice has improved as well, but legal framework has improved faster. Right. So actually the gap grows larger, but even though everything is going in the right direction, it's just the pace that you need to work on. So why? Is it politics? Is it capacity? Something actually we've looked in, we've written about, and we'll be writing about as part of this report. The answer is both. I think it's pretty clear that you've got both here. On the politics side, we think actually some of the biggest answers are to boost demand for implementation. That's why we work with civil society. There's nothing like if you're working on legal reform and you just say, whether it's NRGI or for that matter, the World Bank or IMF or whoever, if the carrot is given at the moment of adoption, whether that's financing, obviously that's not the case for us, but for the broader system, and no one is looking at implementation, nothing's going to happen, right? And you need to make sure that actually the carrot is given during implementation or once implementation is achieved. The other aspect is to actually make sure that there are systems or actors that are pushing for demanding implementation. So when we work on legal reform in a country, for example, say the DRC again on contract disclosure, we make sure to also be working with civil society who are monitoring that. We make sure that we have the vehicles that, aside from the index, on a regular basis are looking at what's happening. But you're right, capacity is a major issue. If we look at, again, statistically, we do a lot of kind of looking at what correlates with the implementation gap. And the biggest correlation is measure of government effectiveness. We use the World Governance Indicators as a tool, but that's basically saying to you that the countries that don't have the ability to govern effectively generally are the ones that are not able to implement also the responsible sourcing elements that we're focusing on here. So that means, let's talk about the EU. That means you need to step up on supporting those countries and their governance measures, right? Especially in the sector, but more broadly. There is no responsible sourcing. Whatever standard we apply on companies, even with the lawsuits, if the core governance structures of the sector, and maybe more broadly in society, aren't in place, right? So I think that's a really important element to focus on, is the support that's needed in order to govern effectively. And I think that's part of the capacity issue. But there are also specific actors that we need to look at. When going back to the politics, there are certain actors in the sector, including on the government side, where we focus, but also we can look at the company and other supply chain actors as well. State-owned enterprises, in our experience, tend to be a real point where there's sometimes resistance within the government, right, for personal interests. When we look at issues, what issues are particularly challenging for implementation? Sometimes those that encroach on the interests of those powerful actors. Even public official asset disclosure is one of the biggest implementation gaps that we find, right? Exactly that measure that government has put in place to say, we're going to talk about what assets public officials have. Rules are high, implementation is low. So I think, getting a little bit more focused on where the needs are, how to boost demand, how to make sure that actually there's also the support to governments that need it. Because again, part of the puzzle that has been mentioned in the conference, but maybe could be mentioned more, there is such great ambition in the countries that we are working in. There's such great expectations, perhaps unreasonably high expectations for the sector and mining, especially with the energy transition, to deliver on the SDGs and other goals that the government and citizens have. Let me stop there.
Thanks. Jonas, I'll ask you to step in there, because I'm guessing just because of the nature of the ILO, and it's supposed to be a government organization, but also the horrendous statistics that still exist in 2021 in this world, political will, capacity, don't care because money matters more. We're also talking about developing countries where that question of economic growth sometimes trumps as a priority over other ethical and societal issues. What's your experience been on this?
Well, thank you, Masuma. Before I begin, let me just clarify that the ILO doesn't only represent governments. We are in fact the only tripartite UN agency, and we represent governments, businesses, employers, as well as workers. So I'm currently an ILO official, and we've been in existence for over 100 years, setting global standards, conventions that reflect the consensus of, as I said, governments, businesses, and workers. So obviously, I'm a firm believer in the value of these standards and those conventions. But to answer your question, I'm actually not convinced that we are currently held back by a lack of standards. Before joining the UN, I worked in the private sector for a global mining company in South Africa. But I also worked previously in the toy industry in China, and before that, or in between, I worked for the textile and garment industry in Southeast Asia and beyond. So standards are important for business. For example, in the toy industry, having international standards on toy safety makes it easier for companies to design and produce products that can be sold in multiple markets. And so the standards make that process easier to manage, you could say. But likewise, if you're a global company and you're looking to engage your supply chain on environmental issues or labor issues, it is helpful to have standards or definitions that are uniform across the world. Concepts such as child labor, forced labor, minimum wage, working hours, health and safety are in most cases already introduced into national legislation through ILO conventions. So this makes the implementation easier. However, I do believe that the biggest barrier to implementation is a lack of ability to drive change. And by that, I mean systematically changing thinking and behavior within an organization or throughout a supply chain. And I've seen far too many attempts to use codes of conduct or social compliance audits as a way to drive change. And in my opinion, it just doesn't work, or at least there's a very real limit to how far it will take you. When I worked for Anglo American, we used a journey model as one of the tools to guide a change process in our supply chain. So we talked about our own organization and our suppliers traveling on a journey with 5 stages: basic, reactive, compliant, proactive, and resilient. And let me explain this to you in a very, very simple way. I can use the example of seat belts, for example, in cars. So imagine that a person is traveling down the road in a car without wearing a seatbelt. This is the basic stage. Now imagine that person seeing a police car ahead and thinking, like Jeff's reference to a lawsuit or some legal penalty. You see the police car ahead and you think, I don't want to get fined, so I'll quickly put my seatbelt on and continue my journey. That's a reactive stage. Now, some drivers think the law says that I have to wear a seatbelt. I want to comply with the law, so I'll wear a seatbelt. That's a compliance mindset. You behave according to the law, and that's what motivates you. But the journey goes beyond compliance. So some drivers want to wear a seatbelt regardless of the law, not because of the legal framework, but because they want to protect themselves and they want to protect the passengers in their car. And that's proactive thinking, that's proactive behavior. And lastly, for many of us, when we get into a car, without even thinking about it, we simply put the seatbelt on immediately. It has become second nature, and our behavior has become resilient. So this is an example of a journey model, and companies and organizations that are very, very good at responsible sourcing understands that both within their own organizations and within their supply chains, they need to move people along on this journey of change. Not to wear seatbelts, of course, that's just an example, but it's the same behavior if you're looking for people to start recycling batteries or eliminating gender discrimination or create good working conditions. It all comes down to changing thinking and changing behavior. And there is no simple magic wand that you can use. You need different tools and you need different intervention on different stages of this journey. Fines, rules, threats only work to move people up to the compliance stage. To make people care and for the change to become resilient, you need other tools. So I don't think we're held back by a lack of standards, but rather by an overly simplistic compliance-driven implementation. And we need much more robust interventions that are designed to deliver real change. And that's not easy, but in my view, that is the most important realization. We're not police officers, we are change agents. Thank you.
That was a really good example, because in my own home country, when the law on seatbelts was introduced, exactly that happened. People were like, oh, police car, let's do this. Jeff, can I bring you in here? Because you've sort of done work not only in Africa, but in Asian communities and regions as well. And this journey that Jonas is talking about, how has your experience been, or what have you noticed with compliance and law and stick and carrot, shall we say?
I mean, I think overall, I'm happy that we have at least got to the point now that even sort of one-time, shall we say, conservative institutions recognize that we do need more more sticks. The World Bank, as an example, would have, was very much against any kind of intervention on industrial policy and regulation to drive performance. And I think, they've come around and started to say now that we need more actual laws to guide behavior. What I would say in terms of where we need to get to is we need to have governments actually adopt these frameworks in a meaningful way. And so just as a tangible example, you'll see, for example, in the Canadian government's their corporate social responsibility strategy, they will say we support the EITI in mining and oil and gas. We think the global reporting initiative is great, but that's it. There's no requirement to use the GRI in terms of being listed on the TSX. There's no, for example, monitoring of companies using the GRI. So, for example, if the Canadian government simply, even without a punitive measure, simply said, each year we are going to list out every company listed on the TSX and whether they use the GRI or not, and give them a score perhaps, right? That small task would drive behavior in a monumental way. And we've seen that with our own work on local procurement and mining, but we've seen that with the Oxfam report cards of companies. I mean, companies don't like getting bad sort of report cards. And even if they say, well, the report card isn't fair, it does drive behavior change. So I would say we need to get actual resources. Governments need to go to resources to implementing these standards. And then, I mean, of course, they do need to get to things like punitive measures if they don't, but just putting resources into this would make a huge difference. And the same thing happens at the company level. I mean, again, the companies sign up for many of these things, but at the end of the day, when I talk to mining companies, it's still very common to see a mining company, a multi-billion-dollar mining company with one person in corporate social responsibility, fully. And they can't possibly be on top of every health and safety requirement and every supplier due diligence issue. I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, we need to start devoting the same amount of people power in companies to the enforcement of these norms as we do for financial norms. And mining companies and all companies will complain, well, it's a reporting burden. But I mean, we have to provide a lot of reporting from financial regulators. So I don't see why financial regulators should take precedence over societal norms. So that's what I would say.
No, excellent point, which sort of brings me to Marie-Therese, given the amount of standards that you've had to read in the last 2 years. I've got two questions for you. How many of them are carrot-based and how many of them are stick-based? And also that idea that, it's all about de-risking. How many of these standards are actually going beyond the idea of de-risking and due diligence and actually looking at it as a mindset, business operation? Or are we not there yet, even in terms of the standards that we keep referring to?
That's a good question. And I can't give you a number on that one, I'm afraid. But I do think that a large number of standards already goes beyond the de-risking. And they provide great guidance on what responsible really is. But yeah, again, many of them are voluntary and many of them are a way for companies to maybe choose the easiest way, but show their compliance to a standard and show to customers to do at least something. So, in our roadmap, we take those standards actually as a starting point. And we asked governments to implement those standards in regulation. So as I said, many of the standards already provide great guidance and great examples on what needs to be done, but the incentive is missing for many companies, I think. So we really said we need to get to the mandatory stage. So coming to this big stick to actually get companies to change and to implement that successfully. I hope that answers your question.
Well, if you answered all of my questions, we wouldn't have to do the rest of the conference. So thank you for leaving some questions open. Amar, let me come back to you because you talked about pushing actors. And some of the stuff that natural resource governance deals with are age-old development issues. It's about poverty alleviation. It is about income generation. It is about education. It is about health. These are things that Adam Smith has been talking about for years, decades, centuries, sorry. Carrot or stick, political will, compliance, this mindset that Jonas was talking about, where it's not about sort of being able to go to the IMF or the World Bank and saying, hey, give us funding because we need this, because even the World Bank's way of funding development programs, and the UN has been stripped of half of its funding for basic needs such as education and income generation. Are we sort of moving to a place where developing countries are being left on their own? Because some of the noise coming out of COP26 is also talking about how the rich industrial countries are not paying for what they had promised to pay for in these developing countries. Are we too hard on developing countries and sort of say, well, DRC needs to do this and we walk away? Well, have we given the funding and the resources and the measures to DRC to improve its NRGI score?
I think there's a real issue there. I mean, I can tell you that from our experience, let me give an example from not Africa, actually the Andean region. We work a fair bit as well, and have worked on issues of kind of critical minerals, our colleagues there. And one thing that came out of a discussion there that really resonated with me was a comment saying, this region can't become a sacrifice zone for energy transition happening elsewhere. Right. And this is the rhetoric that we are hearing increasingly, I think, from, on the one hand, excitement about economic opportunities with all of the risks that come with it, including, real measures, and a lot of stakeholders very much against mining in all shapes and forms because of what they've seen at the social and environmental level, but also plenty of excitement for the opportunities that may be brought by a boom or even the current state of affairs. But then a transition increasingly towards this rhetoric of, wait a minute, what's going on here? What are we being asked to provide, and on what terms? And what's our role in the energy transition? What's our role in the supply chain? And I do think there's some room, and this is I think a place where companies have a role as well, because actually companies are probably the best placed in many ways to assess what's a realistic ambition for the industry, right? So if in a country like, or let's say the Copper Belt, or DRC again, to take the example, there are ambitions of being involved in the supply chain for say on the battery side or whatever. What is realistic? What sort of regional approaches can be validated and say, you know what, this is an ambitious approach, but it's doable. And countries like DRC have made progress in getting a little bit further down the kind of downstream side than they were before, including on cobalt. So these are, it's not to say that there hasn't been movement, but there has been, I think, frustration as well. And I do think that the core issue of support for core development, governance elements is something that has been that has become an increasing issue. One thing that we see in many countries, and it's both on the mining and the oil and gas side, is just the need for financing, right? That's to say, countries using their resources in almost too creative ways to leverage financing. Right. We've seen things in Ghana, for example, where gold royalties were to be assigned to an entity that was going to be listed on the London and Accra exchanges in perpetuity, assignment of Ghana's gold royalties. This is an important, macroeconomic decision that was going to be taken largely on the basis of short-term needs for financing. Right. We see the role that many commodity traders are playing right now in prepayment type of approaches to countries, again, just to get short-term financing. And you're talking there again to talk about actors. And I know you had Trafigura on yesterday, which I think was good with an admission that there are particular players on the trader side that have been opaque, that have been very opaque, and actually are playing very sometimes fundamental roles in government finances in certain countries, particularly on the oil and gas side, but also in certain countries on the mining side, right? So I think there is you do see a bit of desperation. And let's not forget, we talk at COP, everyone obviously has switched to energy transition, and we have in many ways, and appropriately so. We've got a climate crisis on our hands. post-COVID or the present situation and the financing needs that all countries have, especially those with limited fiscal space who couldn't basically borrow their way out of a crisis, we're headed for some a context in which poor decisions can be made. Let's just put it that way. Because there's a need, there's actually opportunity and interests involved, right? There is a need for mineral supply, especially if we were going to meet energy transition ambitions at a global level. The combination of factors is a risky one, right? And so I think on that front, I definitely share your sentiment that it is also a time to focus on fundamentals of kind of development and governance in many of the countries that we're working on. Just one related point that came up, I think Jonas was making the point of we don't have a shortage of standards. I'd almost go further, and this is a bit of a critical eye on our own space, a little bit the civil society space, and say we've got too many standards. There's a risk in our space, and I can tell you we're one of the advocacy groups that pushes the envelope, right? We're the ones that tell you, no, it shouldn't be just this disclosure, it should be also that disclosure. But we need to keep the eye on the ball on implementation. We can't quickly move on to the next item on the agenda because otherwise people won't take it seriously. They'll say, okay, every time you're asking for something more and you're not really checking whether I did the thing you were asking last time, right? So on the standard side, if we are seeing the implementation gap that at least we're seeing on some of the governance indicators that we're focused on in the sector, I think that's also a kind of direction to some of us who work in this space of you need to make sure that we kind of catch up on that pace of implementation. There's what we call kind of natural lags between adoption of a policy or norm and its implementation, and then there's persistent gaps, right? When we do the index in 2017 and 2021 and see that actually the code from 2011 still hasn't been implemented in 2021, there's no excuses there, right? Or there's a much bigger problem of persistent gaps. So I think that's also something we need to start looking at a bit more.
No, I mean, I completely agree. As part of this project, we did a state of play international standards, and that report got way longer than I was planning for it to be, just because there was standard after standard. But Jonas, I'd like to sort of bring you back to something that Amir has raised. Are we getting over creative with solutions? Just because we come up with a standard sitting in our nice offices earning our consultant money, and like, oh, that didn't work. Let's just come up with yet another creative solution. And we're ignoring what is the basic fundamentals that need to be addressed. And the basic fundamentals, like all things, comes down at throwing money at a problem. Do you feel like we haven't thrown enough money at implementation?
Well, that's a good question. I would certainly agree that many of the solutions and many of the resources that are being thrown at problems are not always working. And maybe let me give you an example. So I think the reality is that change is often complex, and the issues that we observe are not the real issues. They're symptoms of something. They're symptoms rather than root causes. And let me give you an example. I live and work in Uzbekistan, and many people have never heard of Uzbekistan, and even fewer are aware that the cotton harvest in Uzbekistan is in fact the world's largest recruitment effort, with almost 2 million people picking cotton every year between September and November. In fact, the last cotton is being picked as we speak. Uzbekistan didn't used to. It's not always been the case, but today Uzbekistan is a success story in the world of work, with over 2 million children having been taken out of child labor and over 500,000 adults being taken out of forced labor since 2017. So in just 6 short years. And you really have a success story here in terms of how raw materials are being produced responsibly. So what changed? How did Uzbekistan achieve this success? Was it international buyers that caused this change? I don't think so. I think the reality is that child labor and forced labor were merely symptoms of a broken model. And Uzbekistan, like all ex-Soviet countries, has a state-driven agricultural model and a tradition of involving school children, teachers, nurses, doctors, and staff from state-funded institutions in agricultural work. This all began to change in 2017 when the new president demonstrated clear acknowledgement that there was a problem and that he was committed to change the situation. I think to give him credit, he understood from the beginning that this was not simply a question of issuing a new law or a new decree announcing the change. That is not how change works. So instead, the country embarked on a change process, which including working with partners like the World Bank, the ILO, the EU, private companies, and other international players, civil society included, to change the agricultural model, because that is really where the problem was. So I have been working with the government here to raise awareness of labor rights, implement feedback mechanisms, strengthening the labor inspection, criminalize forced labor, train judges and prosecutors, allow journalists and activists to work unhindered, privatize, liberalize the cotton sector, and move the country up the value chain to export textile and garments instead of raw cotton. I trust you, I won't do it, but I could speak for hours about this journey. But the reason I give this example is to demonstrate how complex some of these root causes can be and how it often requires a comprehensive effort and the private and the public sector to work together to resolve these issues. So today there is no more systematic child labor or forced labor in Uzbekistan, and the country was recently awarded GSP Plus status by the EU. So now companies can source responsibly from Uzbekistan without exposing themselves to reputational risks. And just one last point, the ILO's engagement in Uzbekistan was in fact brought forward by the employers, by private companies. So I would encourage companies and others to consider a similar approach. Use your access within the ILO, but also within other international organizations to drive change, especially where you are up against very complex or systematic compliance issues. You cannot resolve these issues on your own. So you need to engage and you need to have the right partners and become part of a larger change process. Thank you.
That is actually a very important point. And Jonas, I have seen one of the public advert messages on addressing the child labor stigma in Uzbekistan. It was a very impressive, sort of heartfelt ad. And there's a part of me wondering whether the mining sector needs to pick up on something similar. Jeff, I'm going to come to you with this issue of symptoms and root causes. Now, you and I have experience of African legislation which says local content must be 25%. This is what local content is defined as. And 10 years later, it's still basic services. And people are going, well, why hasn't this happened? We put it in the law. And part of the issue, at least in my opinion, has been the lack of an actual industrial policy that will allow local entrepreneurs. Has the mining sector, in its bid to win local communities, overpromised on what it can actually deliver? So we always hear this story of them coming in and saying, oh, you'll have taxation revenues and you'll have local community development and we'll build this road and we'll do so much more. But a mid-sized mine cannot deliver economic progress for an entire country. And I'm sometimes wondering whether mining, in order to be accepted, has made false promises it cannot keep, and local procurement and linkages and the growth of the local industry is part of that false promise.
Yes, I mean, I think that would be fair to say. I mean, it's not just the mining companies. I mean, it's the governments as well. I mean, when you go to a mining endeavor, you know, all the governments there are trying to seek investment, and they really are sort of portraying the situation as if they will get the investment and things will boom, right? I mean, that is what the governments portray this as well. So it's by no means only the mining companies. What I would say is that on the supplier due diligence issue and how it relates to local content is, I mean, I'm an economic development person, so I want responsible sourcing to be about economic development, not just risk mitigation. We're happy that risk mitigation is driving performance, and if risk mitigation from investors pressure is making mining companies do better to try to buy locally and that kind of thing, because they don't want to have social license problems and problems down the road. I mean, I'll take it. You know, I'll take what if they're driving the right behavior. I'm happy. What I would say on this is, you could have a situation where a mining company can do everything right on a compliance front. They can not cause environmental damage. They cannot have human rights violations in their supply chain. But if they don't actually create many jobs, they're not going to be welcome in the country, right? And so we stress that it's not just enough to not do harm, and investors need to get beyond this idea of they need to address that unfulfilled promise you just said, because if investors are only going to push that you don't buy from child labor, for example, in your supply chain, they're going to invest in mines that eventually have no benefits or very few benefits for local communities and local governments. And why would they want to eventually host these mines if they're not seeing the jobs? And that's only getting worse with automation, of course, because the more automation, the less jobs, and the less jobs, the less procurement opportunities linked to those jobs, like catering and insurance services and everything else. So I mean, yes, all to say, I agree with your point that they have overpromised, but I think we need to step back, and all of these things are systemic. They are not the mining companies' responsibility. They're not the government's responsibility. It's everyone's responsibility. I think the government has to basically steer everything in an ideal world, but approaching it as one company or one government promises this, and that's not really getting us to the solution. The solution is, how do we put in reinforcing feedback loops which make everybody want to solve the issue?
Which actually is a good way of leading me to my question to Marie-Therese. This is this reinforcing feedback loop. Now, if you remember the workshops we had on the roadmap, we divided them into different sections where recycling got talked about, manufacturing got talked about, and extraction got talked about. And one of the interesting trends in those sessions was recycling said, well, the manufacturers need to figure out how they're going to put something together because we can't recycle it. The manufacturers said, well, half of these issues aren't in the extraction side needs to settle this. And if you ended up the extraction sector, it was like everything needs to be done by mining companies. Are we trying to force the responsibility onto other people without actually having that conversation across the value chain and saying recycling can't just put its hands up and say, not my monkey, not my circus?
I can make this very quick. Yes. No, but you actually raised a really important point. And I also wanted to comment on Jonah's example with the cotton industry. And this fits very well together, actually, because what I think is the difference between the supply chain of cotton and the mineral supply chain for the renewable energy sector, for example, is the transparency mainly. And with the transparency comes another stick we haven't talked about yet, the public pressure. So the transparency in the supply chain, the communication among the stages of the supply chain is one of the most important aspects to drive responsible sourcing, in my opinion. And just thinking about renewable energy in general, there is this common misconception that I'm setting up a solar panel and I'm being responsible without actually looking at how this solar panel is being produced. And we can also see that, as you mentioned, between the different stages of the supply chain. So many companies introduced supplier assessments, for example, which is a great practice, definitely. But many of them only look at the first tier supplier, and in better cases, the second tier supplier. But how the actual raw material is being produced, that's either intentionally being ignored or just not considered. And it's the same in the other direction. Manufacturers are producing some kind of technologies and not considering how a recycler can actually recycle that and reuse the materials. So yes, it's just a simple answer. We are not talking enough to each other and not talking enough between the different stages of the supply chain and between the different stakeholders of the supply chain.
There's a part of me which is slightly regretting this panel because we've got 2 years left and you've all told me more issues that we need to deal with to get to the end of this resourcing project. But of course, we were not going to solve the words ill. I am going to move towards wrapping up this panel. And I think one of the requests that I made is I completely understand and appreciate that there are multiple actors and multiple things need to come together to sort the solution out. But if you had one carrot or one stick, which actor would you prioritize over everybody else. And you need to tell me your actor, and you need to tell me whether you're holding a carrot or a stick as well. Since I've always picked on Amir, let's keep the tradition going and get him to start us off first. Amir, carrot, stick, actor.
Carrot stick actor. I think actor, yeah. And for this project, for similar discussions for supply chain initiatives, I'd like to see a more important place for producer countries and producer country governments. So I think making sure that those actors are more prominent in the discussions. The carrot and stick, I won't say necessarily penalize in this way, but the stick is, and it's not just for the producer countries, it's also the companies speak about corruption more clearly. Make sure that it's part of the discussion. When we say due diligence, it's almost kind of code for a series of things, but so many times what actually is talked about are very important issues, child labor and human rights, environmental issues. That aspect of corruption is not brought forward. So that's a stick almost in and of itself. No government official likes to show up to a discussion where corruption is involved. A lot of times companies don't like to either, but I think it's important to make sure. And to Marie-Thérèse's point about transparency, again, here's an area where there has been progress, there has been thinking, there are standards. They haven't been necessarily implemented, right? And sometimes not all we hear about, but much of what people are excited about are technological solutions, blockchain, whatnot. And I'm saying, okay, but let's go back to the fundamentals. Did you know that the minister actually owns this mine, right? This is, and so I think that is a stick, if you like, or a sticky issue, thorny issue that needs to be discussed. The carrot is the ambition, right? What's the aim here? What are we trying to achieve? To Jeff's point, who I totally agree with. There is no aspect of this from my personal and our organizational perspective in the countries that we work with. This doesn't work if it's a matter of, well, actually, we don't want to do this because it's too risky for us. There's reputational issues. The aim is very much to solve these problems so that they can be an avenue for development, so that the BMWs and Volkswagens of the world are happy purchasing cobalt from the DRC, so that we know actually that the impact is a positive one, both on the social and economic and human rights side, but also on that economic portion. I think that's an ambition. So that's the carrot, if you like, for the invitation to bring producer countries greater into the conversation, and the stick is to make sure that some of the big thorny issues are also discussed.
Great. Jonas, actor, carrot, stick.
Carrot, I would go for a carrot. And let me give you an example with Uzbekistan. So I described this whole change that the country have gone through. The president took a gamble in 2017 when he publicly acknowledged that there was a problem. He undertook a complete restructuring of the entire agricultural model. And you can imagine how many people in the power structures in this country that used to benefit from the old system. All these people he had to convince that the reforms were worthwhile and that they would see benefits. Now, I'm often asked, how likely is it that other countries in the region will follow Uzbekistan's lead? How likely is it that similar reforms will be undertaken in neighboring countries? And the answer to that question is, it depends on what results Uzbekistan will see. If Uzbekistan will see an influx of trade, investment, jobs created, I guarantee you other countries will follow. But if Uzbekistan will continue to see skepticism, reluctance, a lack of investment, I guarantee you nobody else will follow and take their lead. So I'm all for carrots. Thank you.
Jeff, carrot, stick, actor. I feel like this is a child's game I've just invented.
I mean, the actor is government. I mean, by far. I mean, they have all the power in the world. Governments think they don't have the power, but they have the power. The only caveat I would say two: one, if the policy they want to implement is not economic, then that's not going to work. I mean, my example constantly on responsible sourcing would be many countries are trying to add value to the minerals, and they're trying to add value to the minerals in a way which is not going to work. I mean, Botswana was able to say to De Beers, you have to beneficiate diamonds here, because if you don't beneficiate them here, you don't have diamonds. So they had the leverage. But then other countries are trying to do the same thing and they don't have that leverage. If the leverage is there economically and it makes economic sense for the company to do these things, the government can ask them pretty much whatever they want, because they're not going to pull out a $3 billion mining investment because of an increase in local content regulations of 5%. So I mean, I would say the government have so much to do. The caveat would be that we need the governments to work together on this, because if they do not work together and make common standards and common floors, shall we say, there is going to be a race to the bottom. That is the challenge that we have. I mean, if the governments have all the power in the world, but if the government beside them lowers their tax rate, in a way which attracts investment, that's not going to work. But if the governments get together and agree we're going to set the same tax rate, again, the companies will have nowhere to go. So I mean, maybe I should be careful about my company friends hearing me say these things, but it's to me, it's just really obvious. I mean, the governments have so much power, and in the long run, if the companies actually will benefit, because they will have better markets and everything else from it too. So that's my 2 cents.
No, I mean, that's fair enough, because I think it's just what the OECD now, after 10 years of negotiation, we're finally getting to a point of a global corporate income tax rate, which is going to be interesting and stopping that race to the bottom. Marie-Therese, you're a gentler person. I'm not sure if you're going to go for a carrot or a stick, but let us have your answers.
Yeah, so in terms of ACTA, I think I have to agree with Jeff actually and go for the governments. I mean, we sort of tend to push the responsibility to companies, but if the frameworks are not there that they can actually be responsible, then their influence is rather limited. And this is not to say that we don't have enough standards. This is to say that maybe some of the standards we have right now are actually hindering responsible practices. Let me actually give you an example from our flagship cases. If you remember, Masuma, we talked to a solar PV manufacturer that set up recycling plants at every manufacturing plant they own. And with every panel they sell on a global level, they already arrange an agreement with the customer to take their panel back and to recycle it. But an end-of-life solar panel is considered as waste. And many countries have very strict regulations on import and export of waste. So it's a huge challenge for them to actually take their panel back and do the responsible thing and recycle it. And I mean, they mentioned one example with a country where they had to negotiate for 5 years to be able to get their panels back to their recycling plant. And these sort of things take time and of course take money. And this actually brings me to the carrot. So our current system actually favors the cheapest product. And being responsible is naturally more expensive. So as long as we don't recognize it in terms of lower taxes for more responsible products or whatever it is, we won't see any major improvements.
Great. Delightful conversation, as I knew I would, with the 4 of you involved in this. I think one sort of as pessimistically as Jonas set us off on this conversation, I feel like we're on a more optimistic ending at the moment. But here's the reality of things. In an effort to be over creative with solutions, we have forgotten the basic fundamentals. We're not paying basic attention to fundamentals that were true 40 years ago and are still true and need to be addressed. The second thing is, in our joy to get standards and guidelines done, as Amar sort of said, that gap between implementation and yet another standard, we're not looking back enough and saying, did we actually implement what we came up with 5 years ago? Are we just moving on to a new standard? From Jonas, I also like the idea of, instead of these piecemeal kind of thing, organizations such as the ILO, traditional, well-established, who've been doing this for decades, go back to them, because it has to be a collective effort at the end. One company or 2 companies doing it will solve some of the issues, but as with the example of Uzbekistan, until we take this on as a larger framework and political will and push, we're not going to get there. And as Jeff sort of said, there are mixtures and there is a mindset with companies, this over ambitiousness to sell, but be careful of what you're selling as mining extraction activities. You need to balance that out as well. So with that, a virtual thank you very much. Interesting conversations. I feel like there's a briefing document coming on called Carrot or Stick after this panel that we'll write for the resourcing project. With that, Ursula, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Baba. Thank you, Masuma. Thank you to everyone who participated in this really intense and interesting discussion. Thank you all. Thanks. Let me continue with the next part that we have planned. And before we go there, I just want to mention again, would you kindly fill in the survey, the little poll we have? It will help us a lot with the ongoing work there. And if you have registered for this conference, you have access to all the materials of the conference and even more in the resource department of the website. Let's look at the next part. The resourcing is an EU project, you know that, and we want to give the chance to present related projects and initiatives and exchange with them in order to learn, give mutual learning a chance. So there will be a presentation of 3 projects now, and after that there is a chance to participate in an informal exchange on these projects with the project owners and with the team of our project and with others if you want. So we already presented 3 projects yesterday. There will be 3 projects today and another 2 projects for you to listen to tomorrow. So today we have 2 Horizon 2020 projects. There is the next, which developed new geomodels, new exploration technologies, but also a social license to explore. There is the SUMAG Pro, a German project on recycled rare earth magnets. And there will be a project funded by the Swiss Program for Research on Global Issues for Development, Resource Impact Dashboard that measures and visualizes the impact of mining activities. I'm very happy to welcome the 3 presenters, and you can participate via Slido at any time. Please use it also during the presentations. As soon as you come up with a question or a comment, feel free to put that in there and my colleagues will edit it and send it then to the presenters. So let's get started with the project next, which will be presented by Dirk de Ketelaere, who is Senior Consultant at Integrated Research Management. This is a Horizon project, just like as ours, and it has almost the same timing. It just finished, sorry, it's not the same time, it just finished in September 21. So the results are there and really fresh and new. So as I said, the project focuses on the development of new geomodels, innovative exploration technologies, and data analysis methods for the exploration of mineral deposits in the EU. May I give the floor to Dirk? He's already there. Would you kindly present your project, please?
Thank you, Ursula, and thanks to the organizers for inviting this presentation. Thanks also to the audience who joined us to a presentation entitled A Practical Toolkit Addressed to Mineral Exploration and Mining Companies, which, as Ursula mentioned, is an outcome of the next project. Next slide. The core objectives of the Horizon 2020 Next project were concerned with the development of new environmentally sensitive exploration technologies, and also with the gaining of a better understanding of the factors that affect local attitudes towards mineral exploration and obviously mining. Next slide. The motivation for the toolkit is twofold. First, we noted that from literature review that there is very little research conducted on the social license to explore theme. And also that existing toolkits do not really provide us with an answer to the question of what to communicate about the technologies that are used. Next slide. So the toolkit has been structured in 4 chapters. In the first chapter, we look at what exploration companies expected us to produce in this toolkit and what it offers. Then there are 2 chapters that deal respectively with new insights, new tools and knowledge pertaining to mineral prospectivity mapping and pertaining to the findings from the social license to explore research. And then in the final chapter, we bring some practical tips, recommendations for stakeholder engagement. Next slide. So in the second chapter, we kick off with the new insights that were gained through NEXT in how ore deposits are formed. We also take a look at how snow sampling can actually be used for mineral prospecting. Next slide. Or rather, this is the Pechacucha. Wait. Then we have an article on advances in mineral exploration in glaciated terrains. And the developed drone, the non-invasive mineral exploration technology developed by the company Radai, was picked up by the European Commission's Innovation Radar. Yeah, that's the trick with Pechacucha. So if you do so, I'm afraid, Ursula, you have to wait for the slides to pass, not to click next. No, we are way ahead in the presentation. Could we go back to how mineral ore deposits are formed and just give it time? Yeah. So the Pechacucha applied here. I'm sorry, but I had to fit my slides in 8. And then, yeah, there's 20 slides that have somehow been compressed in this way. So leave it just to change screen.
Okay.
Yeah. So as I said, this newly developed drone in NEXT was picked up by the European Commission's Innovation Radar, which was quite an excitement. And this then spurred on the company Radai to build in additional safety features. And we see here a parachute trigger. They also fitted in a geofence trigger or a geofence system that turns the drone back if it flies away from the area. And then the team of the University of Lorraine produced the software to process data from handheld devices. In the area of remote sensing, we have 2 write-ups on the use of satellite imagery-derived products, which are then at the basis of the concept design of a satellite image crawler. And also artificial intelligence was used in NEXT. So here 2 write-ups, one on predictive mapping through the use of self-organizing maps, and one about transforming regional scale predictions to target scale detections. Now, these artificial intelligence based approaches were applied to the Rajapalot test site in Finland. And we get a quote here from the chief exploration geologist at Mawson, Nick Cook, who informs us that he drilled where the GDK predicted mineralized horizons through artificial intelligence indicated. And the result was that now, today, the gold cobalt resource estimate is at least twice the estimate that was predicted prior to the start of the NEXT project. So this is a really huge achievement. Next slide. In the chapter, we share the outcome research that there were 3 different case studies bringing different contexts. The Mawson site in Finland, where only exploration takes place, the Aitik, long time tradition of mining, and a little bit to the south of the Arctic, Jokkmokk, where currently no mining takes place. So the activities included interviews with local organized actors, also interviews with local residents and surveys with local residents in Finland and in Sweden. And these surveys and interviews are at the basis of a series of write-ups that form the 3rd chapter. From the research on the social license to explore, we take home that attitudes to exploration vary from place to place. They are context dependent. And perhaps this first lesson is something we could follow up on in the exchange, informal exchange session after this presentation. Also, the understanding of the context and drivers shaping attitudes can help to explain or foresee these attitudes. High quality company community engagement is obviously important and can affect attitudes. And then crucial to the ambit of next, the lesson is that even though the environmentally sensitive technologies do reduce the environmental footprint and were shown to be welcomed by local actors, they do not in fact determine local attitudes. And then finally, company websites are important communication tools that can be used more efficiently to interact with local actors at the earliest possible stage of an exploration project. Next slide. So in the final chapter, we bring some practical recommendations to start with why to communicate. Well, an Ernst & Young survey in 2019 and 2020 revealed that the sector, the mining sector, consistently places the risk of losing the license to operate as the #1 risk in the mining sector. How to communicate? Here, actually, we brought synergy with another Horizon 2020 funded project, Mireux, that issued SLO guidelines for Europe and an associated toolbox, and that brought with it a very large array of tools on how to engage with stakeholders. As to the question when to communicate, again, we bring synergies. There is the Finnish toolkit, and there is also the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada toolkit, which possibly was the first toolkit to be brought, which are both structured on when to communicate. Where to communicate draws lessons gleaned from the info day that was only info day, unfortunately, that could be organized in Finnish Lapland, and well, reinforce the notion that the choice of a venue and the seating arrangements do matter. The final section in chapter 4 is with whom you may also wish to communicate. And here actually we bring another development from Next. It's a new mapping tool on Cordis Portal, which was implemented by a team at the University of Lorraine in collaboration with the Cordis team in Luxembourg. And unfortunately, I cannot really explain more about the functionality of this new tool. What I would like to say as beta testers of the P2CO tool is that we know that the Cordis portal was always a goldmine of information, but now this goldmine has truly become much more easily accessible. Next slide. So in conclusion, we can say that the toolkit has somehow managed to integrate all of the technological advances as well as the outcomes of the research on the SRE team in an easy to grasp language. And in response to the expectations from the exploration companies that we interviewed in Rovaniemi back in 2019, they asked us for the toolkit to be process oriented. That is to provide answers to the questions of what, why, how, when, where, and with whom to communicate when engaging with stakeholders. And my final slide. I would like to thank you for your attention, but I would also like to take the opportunity to thank in particular Juha Kahia, project manager from the Geological Survey of Finland, who coordinated the next project, for inviting our company to join this project. And I hope to have shown what a truly inspirational journey this has been. And once again, I thank you all for your attention. Thank you.
And I thank you for your precise presentation of your project. And there is already a question from the audience here. Apart from the development of technological solutions, what are the most important factors or pillars to make exploration more sustainable and responsible in your view? You are muted now. I cannot hear you.
Because I muted myself. That is an excellent question. And maybe what I should have also added in my presentation, because we were asked to answer a question, what does our project bring to resourcing? And so the main lesson here learned is that responsible mining starts from responsible exploration. It's really a first and necessary step, because if something goes wrong, if negative perceptions start to emerge already during the exploration stage, they tend to carry on through the mining stage, eventually the mining stage. We have to consider at the same time that exploration is full of ambiguity. It's a very risky business, both from an investor point of view, because statistically, only 1 in 1,000 mineral exploration projects make it to a mine. But whenever an exploration company moves into an area, particularly an area which is not accustomed to exploration or mining it raises expectations. So there is a two-tongued ambiguity here. It raises expectations, it also causes fears. And then there's loads of things we can discuss. But what we have again learned is that these perceptions are context dependent. So in Finnish Lapland, for example, where the lifestyle is very closely tied to nature, people's perception, if they perceive in Finnish Lapland that there is going to be a negative impact on the environment, this becomes a social risk. This is what my colleagues at the Luleå Technical University and University of Lapland have communicated to us all throughout this project through the research, the surveys they conducted there. So these are, I should think, quite important lessons. Another lesson from the technological perspective is that we have really seen it is possible through a legacy of data that can be available for an area, like in the Erzgebirge in Eastern Germany, where there is centuries-old tradition of mining. There was no need to set foot anywhere. Artificial intelligence mined all the historical data sets and pinpointed to an area that was with very high potential, prospectivity, and when actually they found a mineralized horizon of tungsten tin, which had not been mined to date. So there are actually technologies available. Also the snow sampling, I mean, it's the minimum impact. All of this can help companies, exploration companies, to minimize on the locations of actual drill cores. And these are ultimately necessary, of course. But if we can reduce the number significantly, and also we can gain on the lead time, because very often exploration takes years. And in Next, we have shown that in weeks, through artificial intelligence, in days, they can come up with predictions of where to place drill cores. Okay, I hope I have answered some of the questions. There's loads to answer.
There's lots. Very good. There's lots to say. Thank you very much. And there will be time in the informal talk afterwards, right, to continue on that if somebody is interested. There is one more question. May I ask you for a short answer now, and then we can continue later? This question is, does the toolkit, especially on the part of SLEs, align with certain international guidance, such as the UN guiding principles, for example?
We have aligned the Next toolkit as much as possible with existing toolkits. I did not have the time, but we have also aligned it with the Aarhus Convention. This is maybe something that is not often done, and it's a whole chapter on its own. But maybe I don't recall specifically mentioning the UN guidelines, but there is a lot of references to existing international guidelines, clearly. Anyhow, we can discuss, as you said, in more detail during the informal exchange session. Right. I'm looking forward to that.
Me too. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for presenting and for staying. Thanks a lot. So let me continue with the second project. SUSMAG Pro will be presented by Carlo Burkhardt. He's professor at the Pforzheim University in Germany. This is the project that ends more or less in parallel with our project in November 2023. The project aims to develop a pilot supply chain for recycling rare earth magnets. And I just need to switch my to be used in different industry. Those are seen as critical raw materials in the European Union because there is a high dependency. and they are key to many technologies for green transition. May I ask Carlo to present your project? Thank you.
Yes, sure. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present our project here, which is called SUSMAG Pro for Sustainable Magnets Production. And thank you very much also for the introduction, because for a lot of people, magnets are still the clasp of a handbag or something you put onto the fridge, but not a very critical material which we need for energy transition in generators, in motors, in sensors. So they're really key to our modern society. And next slide, please. Our project is really an industrialization project. So it's not research anymore. The project asks to develop and demonstrate in pilot plants that it's possible to recycle magnets on a larger scale. So the pilot plants are supposed to supply 110 tons of material per year at the end of the project. And if you see that currently the recycling rate is around 1%, that's maybe a small number if you look at 110 tons, but it's really a big step forward to show that it's industrially feasible and also upscalable. The project itself is one of the largest recycling projects in the Horizon 2020 with a funding of nearly 13 million. And we are 18 partners, and we're covering the whole supply chain from the recycler Stena to the end user like ZF or Grundfos for motors, pumps. Also Siemens Gamesa is an associated partner here. And the total budget is nearly 15 million because the industrial partner, they have to bring some of their own funding. And next slide, please. Yes, and the concept itself, and that shows how difficult the recycling of magnets really is, that first of all, we have to identify in which components we really have the magnets. And that may be quite simple if you look at the traction motor of a new car, because they're nearly exclusively rare earth magnets on basis of neodymium iron boron are built in. But if you look, for example, in a flat screen TV, it could be a ferrite, it could be a samarium cobalt magnet, it could be a neodymium iron boron magnet. And one of the main issues is that magnets are currently not labeled. So they're all silvery and shiny, but you only know it when you detect it. So the first approach is that we really identify what are the key applications to build and set up some sensoring that we automatically can process with hole probes, with sensors, what kind of magnet is in, where is it, and then also to make robot devices that really then grab the item, cut out the magnet for further reprocessing. And what you see on the third and the fourth slide is an optimized unit that we already finished right now, that's supposed to detect in hard disk drives of computers where the magnet is. Then it will be chopped off and goes to recycling. And the whole thing is built as a portable device that you can go to the server farms like to Google or Facebook or Amazon and really do the whole thing on site, because the hard disk drives have to be shredded for data protection. And once we separated the magnets, we have to remove them from the houses to look into glues, mechanical fixtures, and coatings. Show you later on why this is important. And then we are using we're recycling the magnets with a process that it's IP protected. That's a hydrogen processing of magnetic scrap, which is environmentally friendly, much friendlier than going back to the element. I show that on the next slide as well. And then we are reprocessing the recycled material into new magnets by 4 different manufacturing routes. So if you go to the next slide, please. The assessment of the scrap is complicated enough, and so far we have dismantled over 100 applications, analyzed them for recyclability, and you see here some pictures. It's a steering wheel, servo steering motor, then you see audio models of mobile phones. On the middle row, you see wind turbine magnets and magnets in a traction motor of a car. And what we looked at are different sets of parameters. One's the accessibility, so how fast can you get to the magnet? How easy is it to open? What kind of contaminations do we get? And to give you a simple example, the first magnet you see, the servo steering motors, has a material value of about 14 euros. but the accessibility in a normal standard car takes over an hour, which is about 40 euros. So it's very difficult to extract this. The wind turbine magnet you see just below is quite easy to access, and there's a large amount of the material there. But here you see it's all contained in glue, which burns off when you thermally demagnetize the magnet. So that's another issue in recyclability. And so we look at this, we grade first accessibility and fixation. And then of course, in a second set, once we get the magnet, what are the magnetic properties? What's the microstructure like? What coatings have we on? What chemical composition? Which means how high is the value to really recycle it? So next slide, please. We put all this in a database, and that's a very comprehensive database which covers the end-of-life magnets, also the powder we generate, and the reprocessed magnets afterwards. And this helps us really to build up a database which is very valuable then for further processing. I covered some things in black because they are manufacturer confidential, so please apologies for that. So next slide, please. Then we mapped all the applications to see what kind of magnetic grades, because there are also low and high qualities, temperature resistant magnets and so on, in which applications we will find which magnets. That also helps us for the reprocessing to target what are the future applications for these magnets. However, a little issue is here that we have a kind of backlog. It's easy to understand that when we get a wind turbine magnet back, it's about 10 years old. So this will be a kind of prototype stage. And today's magnets quantity may be much different. And it's very easy to see in a wind turbine that some of the magnets we start with are N35, which is relatively low grade. And now the new ones have N48. So we have to take into account that backlog when looking into this data. Next slide, please. And what you see here is now the process we are using. I don't know if you can start the video. It should work by clicking on a picture. Yes, please. And we expose the magnet to hydrogen at room temperature at 1 bar. So this is just for show in a glass gauge. Normally it's done in a pressure reactor. And what's happening is that the neodymium, this rare earth element that's at the grain boundary, it expands when it absorbs the hydrogen. And then it really converts the whole magnet into a friable powder, which we can directly use. And what you see, these shiny flakes that go off, this is a protection coating that can, in ideal cases, just be sieved off, and then you separate the coating from the material. On the next slide, please. And this allows us to go to a very environmentally friendly and also energy favorable recycling loop. Because when you look, well, this is a whole value chain for primary production that you see that starts with mining and solvent extraction of the rare earths. Then you have to refine it to produce the neodymium iron boron alloy, then the magnet, and then the components. And if you go to conventional recycling via hydrometallurgy, you have to go back to solvent extraction. We keep the magnetic material as an alloy and can go directly with its powder into magnet production to make sintered polymer bonded or also metal injection molded magnets. And in a case of that we have heavy contaminations, we can also go to recasting. This would be then the route D, where we go back to the alloy and refine it and probably add some of the alloying materials to bring it into its original state. But still all 4 routes are 90% less toxic and about 70% more energy efficient than the primary production. So next slide, please. And in our database, we then covered the powder of the different sources and also the reprocessed magnets, and it allows also to us to blend the different materials. So if you have a very high grade and a very low grade material, for example, we can blend these together and target really the magnet that we produce out of it. So next slide again. And here, just to give you an example, what is the real life we are struggling with, you see here in our reactor just different coatings. If you start the video, and you will see they're behaving extremely different when decomposing. You see, for example, one in the right lower corner, that the coating is a carcass which can be easily separated. If you look in the two middle ones, you have a fine powder where the sieving is virtually impossible. And you saw in the upper left-hand corner that some of the magnets take much, much longer to react. And this is now currently our task to separate what are good, what are bad coatings for recycling, just to come up then with products that are easier for recycling. So next slide, please. And this is, well, our impact and our business model, if you look at it, because what we are already installing is a kind of closed loop recycling of magnet products with partners and major clients. And it's very easy because then we know exactly what we want to, what we get back from a pump supplier, for example. For mixed scrap, it's much more complicated from the open scrap sources. Here we have to do a lot of this recycling or also development work. And what we try to do is total life contracts with major users and investors. So wind turbines is one of the main targeted scraps. And with all what you see here, the green and the purple actions that will take place with the project, we hope to shift the recycling rate over 15 to finally to 25% of potentially recyclable materials in 2035. So that's in a nutshell what we did so far and what we are planning to do. And yeah, open to your questions right now.
Thank you very much. That was precise too, also time-wise. There are two questions already here. Yeah, the first one, what is the major obstacle to scaling recycling of permanent magnets at the moment? Is it a collection of end-life material? Is it technology? Is it missing standards or anything else?
There are a couple of obstacles, really. I mean, the technology, once the magnet is on the table and you know what kind of coating you have on, is state of the art. But accessibility is a problem, not suitable design. So as you've seen with these wind turbines, some glues which are not technically necessary, but cause us a lot of trouble. It's that the magnets are not labeled, that you don't know outside of the component, but you get inside. And then overall, it's also, let's say, the missing awareness of collecting the scrap, and also some boundary conditions, like scrap is not exported, like there should be a recycling quota, things like that. There should be a labeling in place.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. And another question, in how far does collection systems, logistics determine or influence technological approaches of recycling? Did you consider this in your research?
We are starting to consider it. And as I said, closed loop recycling, of course, is preferable currently because this gives us the quantities we need also to set up the technology and to bring it into large scale. But of course, waste exports are difficult, yeah, especially with electronics. And yeah, the logistics in general, because the material value and the magnetic content in some of the applications is not very high. So as I said, in a servo pump, you have about 14 euros of material. If you take into account the logistics and everything, yeah, you have to be very competitive to compete with current Chinese prices anyway. And you have a tax advantage of 32%. So on the legislation side, there's a lot to do to make this also attractive and to save these critical materials. So we're looking more into the technical option that is possible, but this is also asked to us by the political stakeholders because, of course, they don't want to introduce recycling quotas without knowing that it's not technically feasible.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Dirk, and thank you also for staying afterwards. So if there are more questions, you as participants can participate in these informal exchanges. Thank you, Dirk. Let me go on.
It's Carlo, but still, thank you very much.
Sorry, I'm sorry. Thank you, Carlo. Sorry, thank you.
Yeah, okay, great, thanks.
May I go to the third presentation of today, the third project. This will be presented by Felicitas Fischer. She's a researcher at the ETH Nadel Center for Development and Cooperation in Switzerland. And she will talk about the resource impact dashboard. That's a data collection visualization tool that monitors indicators on the environment, local economy, and social relations in mining areas. Please, Felicitas.
Yes, thank you very much. Welcome from my side. Thank you for the invitation. My name is Felicitas, and I'm going to introduce you to the resource impact dashboard, which is, as was mentioned, it's an online available and publicly accessible, free to use tool to measure impacts of mining really at the extraction side. Next slide, please. We developed this this dashboard, this project together with our partners in Burkina Faso, in ISRA, as well as in Mozambique, Universidad de Lourdes, with funding from the Program for Research on Global Issues for Development, funded by the Swiss State and National Science Fund. Next, please. First, I'm going to quickly show you how the resource impact dashboard looks like, and this platform, and what it is doing exactly. So as I said, it's about measuring local impacts of mining, and it has basically three main features. The first one, which is already on that slide, is that it has a very comprehensive and holistic view on what local development impacts are. So it looks at development outcomes on the economic, the social, the environmental, and the institutional level. Next. It also has a very balanced view on what those impacts are, and that because it includes different perspectives. What does that mean? Next, there is basically, it triangulates, the database triangulates data from three different sources. So the first source is actually company data. So companies provide data on local employment, also local procurement, on their environmental monitoring, or also on the interaction they have with communities or social investments they make on the local level. Next, the second data source is actually a household survey that is done in a 20 kilometers radius around the mine. And there we get data on the income and well-being of the communities living adjacent to the mine, as well as on community relations, on the perception of communities towards the company, but also towards local institutions. Next, the third data source is actually just public institutional data, mainly on health and education, social service provision. Next. So with that, with kind of triangulating those three different data sources, the RID shows a more balanced and nuanced picture of the local impacts development on local development impacts, kind of taking into account all the different stakeholders. And by doing so, it established a common ground for deliberations and kind of like for dialogue on also resolving disagreements between local communities and companies. So often what we see is that we have two different discourses that are quite disconnected. On the one side, there's a lot of a discourse on local impacts of mining steered by NGOs, which try to focus on the problems and where there arise problems, and then the negative impacts. And then on the other hand, we have a discourse that is more often steered by more the company side, which basically stress all the positive opportunities and impacts that mining can have. And the idea here really is to have a common ground for, yes, constructive dialogue and also for evidence-based policymaking. Next, the third aspect of the resource impact dashboard is actually that it has a standardized methodology. This means that it is very easy to use and accessible. So stakeholders who want to insert another mine can just focus on bringing the stakeholders on board. So focus on contacting, the company or doing the household surveys. Next, what the standardized methodology also means is that it provides data that is comparable in the end. So you have, for example, you can compare one mine over the whole life cycle of the mine, so to speak. So from exploration to later stages. And then also, of course, comparable across different mine sites and across different regions. Next. This is how the platform looks like. So you have on the left-hand side always a satellite image of the mine, and then on the right you have the different variables, and they're grouped into different categories, as you can see on the top. For example, in this, that we are in the category of well-being and services, and there you have, for example, one variable on wealth distribution. So how is the wealth in that particular region compared to the national level? Next. We have the category education and jobs, where, for example, there is company data on the employment. So who does the company actually employ? Is it national staff, regional staff, international staff, and also which skill level? As you can see here, this particular example, this mine employs a lot of regional male workers, and most of those workers are in the semi-skilled level. If you look at management numbers, it's quite different. There's more international staff, for example. Next. You have obviously environmental impacts, and here you have, for example, the hazard perception of the communities. Do they perceive a certain hazard, and do they, most importantly also, do they contribute this hazard as to the mine? So do they see the mine as the main cause of this hazard? So you can see here, for example, there is a very high perception of dust. However, not all of that dust is actually attributed to the mine. Next. We have also companies, of course, inserting their monitoring data, environmental monitoring. In this example, it's water quality. So how many samples did they take in the year of reporting, and how many of those were above a certain limit? And they also report their benchmarks, obviously. Next, the last category, we have social capital. And here there is, for example, are indicators on the conflict. So how do the communities perceive the level of conflict with the mine? You have something on grievance mechanisms. How do they use the grievance mechanisms, and do they trust and kind of appreciate those grievance mechanisms, and also on compensation? Next. Here we also have something on the more general question on the acceptance of the mine, and that's actually quite interesting. You can see here the third bar is the overall support of mining, and what we've seen in our pilot mines, where we developed the tool, is actually all of those mines. The overall support of mining was quite high. So here it's nearly 80%, meaning that communities not only perceive negative impacts, but they might also, so there's actually quite a high support of mining. Obviously, if you look into the details, for example, on information here, you can see that outcomes are quite negative in this, quite small in this example. Also, the consultation, what you can see here, only very little people, actually it's less than 5% in this example, said that they were consulted at some point during extraction, and but those that were consulted actually saying, that's the last two bars, that the consultation was very useful and very respectful. So actually, this is a great missed opportunity for this particular mine example here. Now, next slide, please. If we talk about what are the goals of this, why are we doing this, and why do we have this platform to measure local development impacts? Well, there's basically two main goals or questions that the resource impact dashboard tries to answer. First, how can we promote better local development outcomes? So how can we make sure that the impacts are actually positive and not negative? And then also, how can we improve the way the different stakeholders deliberate with each other? So basically the quality of conflict, always assuming that there's always a potential of conflict and always like different interests. And basically the sentence in italics here is kind of like the rationale of the dashboard, saying in order to find a solution to local development and also to conflict, you first need to agree on what actually the problem is. And the answer the resource impact dashboard poses is by measuring local impacts of mining, we can find out where the actual problems lie, and that in a holistic and balanced and systematic way, as I said in the beginning. Next slide, you see the URL up there, resource-impact.org, and there's also some more information documents on there. And lastly, I would like to quickly say three things about the the overlaps or the relevance for the resourcing project. I was asked to also include that. So first, obviously what we're looking here at is the extraction phase. And as I said, it's a platform to measure local impacts and to kind of inform everybody about the risks, the positive and negative impacts, and also the potential of conflict while extracting. And that's key for responsible sourcing, of course. And then secondly, it goes a bit beyond that. It also has the transformative component of actually, trying to lead to better deliberations. And then thirdly, it is available and easy to use. So downstream companies and actors can actually insert new minds of their supply chains and kind of make use of this dashboard approach of measuring local impacts of mining. Next slide is my thank you slide. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to discuss with all of you.
I thank you, Felicitas. It's always hard to stick to the time, but this was also perfect. 2 questions are there from the audience, which I would ask you to answer. The first one is probably important one for dashboards. How is the data on the platform being verified or validated?
Thanks. That's an interesting one. So for since there's different data sources, it's difficult to, household surveys, you can't really verify. They're mostly about the perception of communities, right? So when we measure perception, this is not really hard data. We can't go and ask people, did you actually really get compensation, and how much did you get? But the reason also is not, so the idea also is not to include in those household surveys hard data, but it's really to look about the perception. And I was really happy to also hear, in the first presentation, there was the topic of raising expectations from explorations, right? And I think what Dirk said was very on the point. Often it's really about what do communities perceive, and that makes out the potential of conflict and potential problems, and not necessarily so how they perceive the compensation they get might be as important as to know how much they actually got and if this was according to a law or not. And then to verify the other information, it's actually the company data, for example, is all that's all data that companies have to report on anyway. So it's not rocket science in a sense. So their monitoring of environmental impacts, for example, they will publish anyway. But the trust is with the companies as well. So what they put in will be put up there. So we don't verify or anything.
Okay, thank you for that. And there's one more question. It's a rather long question, and I have to ask you for a short answer, if that's possible at all. And then you can also continue afterwards in the exchange. Is the use of satellite images to be foreseen to use in a more comprehensive GIS mapping? Will this be consolidated in a regional view on risks and mitigation measures of overall mining activity in specific geographic area?
Thanks. That's interesting. Actually, we do work more and more in our institution with satellite imagery, and also in terms of impacts, obviously. So you can see, for example, if there was in-migration into a region and new settlements, etc. For this particular project, the satellite image really it's always updated, obviously. And what satellite images are important for in our process is for, finding out in which communities to make the household surveys. So that's where the satellite images are used for. No, there's not a development of the platform foreseen in terms of inserting more satellite images over time, for example, and then make more variables, so to speak, out of those satellite images. So until now, no, but yeah, it's an interesting thought and definitely up, and something that we see more often.
Okay, thank you very much, Felicitas, for your contribution up until now, and we'll see you later in the informal exchange. Thank you. So it's up to me now
Thanks.
to introduce this informal exchange. It will be moderated by my colleague, Alexander Graf, who is the manager of the resourcing project. And there will be the opportunity to get further in touch with those projects you just heard about and with our team, and discuss even more in about a 30-minute informal talk without any recording, just talking about the project and the mutual learnings. There will be a separate Zoom link. I will show you in a second how you can get there. And it's just up to me now to invite you for tomorrow. This will be day 3. We will start at 2 p.m. Central European time tomorrow with the topic intersection of circular economy and responsible sourcing. And I would be very happy to see you there again. And in the meantime, it's up to me to thank you as a participants to make this event possible, because without participants, there is no event. So thanks for being here, and maybe we'll see you tomorrow again. I would like to thank all the expert speakers and facilitator of today, and the technical support in the background. There are 4 of my colleagues working hard to make it all possible: Andreas, Angelo, Constanze, and Noé in the background. And last but not least, if you find 2 or 3 minutes, would you fill in the survey we have on the website? So now let's go to the informal meeting. You don't have to hurry, just take a couple of minutes, get a drink and go there. It's really an informal and convenient thing. Here is, you see how you can get there in the resources department of the website. You enter your password, which you did receive in case you registered. And there you will find the link on the top of the resource part. There is a Zoom meeting there. Go there and enjoy the next half hour. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.